Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 304. This is of course the Patreon Drydock, so buckle in, listen to all the questions and answers, and hopefully come out of it the other side intact. Let's get on with the question, shall we? Admiral King's preferred shaving implement asks, when I was at elementary school, my scouting troop spent the night a couple of times on USS Alabama. We slept in the crew's bunks and had the run of the ship, scrambling up ladders and the like. Do you have any idea if this kind of outreach is common for museum ships today, or was this an oddity of an approach to health and safety peculiar to the deep south of the United States back in the early 1990s? I don't know about museum ships in other places, in terms of other countries, but I do know this is still an ongoing thing very definitely in the US. For example, USS New Jersey, I've actually been aboard her when various kids groups have been debarking after having spent a night on the ship. And similarly, when I visited Galveston Naval Park, USS Stewart was just debarking the last of an overnight group there. So it's definitely something that's still going on, and as you can tell from those two ships, it's something that's going on the very largest and the very smallest of US museum ships. Now, just due to logistics and size issues, I'm relatively sure probably the museum submarines don't do it, albeit I'm willing to be corrected, but there would obviously have to be very limited numbers on a submarine. And obviously I don't know if it applies to all ships, because, you know, Alabama does, Stuart does, New Jersey does, but whether that means Lexington does, or Hornet does, or Midway does, etc., obviously each ship is going to have its own requirements, its own restrictions, its own policies, and I suspect, being in the US, possibly even each state has its own requirements and restrictions, which may vary exactly what they can and can't do. As far as overseas goes, well, I'm not sure for the UK. As I say, I don't know about other ships, museum ships in other countries. If you happen to know, then chime in the comments below. But certainly in the UK, I suspect it would be possible. Certainly when I was a kid, there were plenty of, spend a night in a museum kind of activities. But I think the main issue in the UK is the relatively small number of museum ships we have and whether or not they would be suitable, because with the best one in the world, I can't see anybody putting a school group overnight up on HMS Victory. But that might work on something like Belfast or Cavalier or Caroline. But again, I don't know if they do that these days. Paul Frederick asks, in the movie, ship captains often order right or left standard rudder. What is standard rudder? Is it based on the handling of that specific ship, or is it a fleet-wide standard, or just Hollywood speak? It is realistic for the US Navy. Bearing in mind, there was a previous question a few dry docks back about why some navies use port and starboard and the US Navy uses right or left rudder. And so if someone says right or left standard rudder, but they're portraying a Royal Navy officer, that would be incorrect, because standard rudder aside, the Royal Navy still uses port and starboard. But in any case, the standard rudder in the US Navy is a rudder setting, and it can be 12, 15, 20 degrees or something in that region, give or take a little bit, which has been pre-calculated to make a ship turn within a certain radius, which would be called the tactical radius. And obviously what the standard rudder is varies from ship class to ship class, but the idea, of course, as mentioned in the wider question, harkening all the way back to US standard battleships, is that if the fleet, let's say, is ordered to all turn 90 degrees, you don't want everyone going, okay, well, we're all going to put our rudders over 15 degrees, or we're all going to put our rudders full over, because that's going to result in ships turning at different rates and in different radii, which is going to, at best, stuff up the formation of the fleet. At worst, it's going to lead to collisions. So what you would do is you would calculate a tactical diameter or radius that you wish your fleet to turn at. So let's say you want your fleet to turn at, I don't know, a 700 degree radius. It's being a little bit generous, but let's say that's what we want it to do. And then everybody would go, obviously this isn't done at the time, this is done beforehand. So everyone would discuss the various capabilities of the ships and go, okay, well, for this destroyer to turn at on a 700-yard radius at fleet cruising speed, we need to have the rudder over at 12 degrees. But for this cruiser, it needs to be at 17 degrees. And for this aircraft carrier, it needs to be at 15 degrees, and so on and so forth. And that now becomes the standard rudder. So then when the order is given to, everybody, let's go 40 degrees to starboard, then everybody says, okay, well, right standard rudder, and the whole fleet can now turn all nicely in formation. And even outside of formation, it's a very useful thing because it gives you a known value. So when you say right or left standard rudder, you know, okay, well, I'm going to turn in this specific radius. Whereas obviously if you put less rudder on, you're going to turn wider. If you put more rudder on, you're going to turn much closer in. So it's very handy to know for maneuvering. The other thing that you have to remember is that related to that is there's obviously orders for full rudder, but even when you're giving an order for full rudder, unless it's an absolute life or death emergency, in almost all situations, a rudder will not go all the way to its stops. It will stop a few degrees short of its stops, simply because, thanks to the way that rudder motors and steering gear works, if you slam the rudder all the way over into its stops, there is a not insignificant chance the rudder might jam. So if, let's say, your rudder can go all the way up to 35 degrees, in normal circumstances, full rudder might be 32 or 33 degrees, because you can pretty much guarantee you'll be able to pull the rudder back to center in that way. Whereas if you slam the rudder all the way over, it hits the stops at 35 degrees, that may not come back. You may end up doing a big circle. Rebel Skvirl asks, referencing the many invasion scares that Britain experienced in the mid to late 19th century, did France, the main culprit in most of these panics, ever actually plan to invade the UK? And if so, how did they propose to transport and supply their troops in the face of Royal Navy opposition? As far as I can tell, outside of theoretical exercises and keeping themselves up to date on what Britain's defences were like as a matter of just general military principle, like, for example, this fort, which clearly has not had its textures rendered just yet, the French don't seem, in the post-Napoleonic War period up to the First World War, to have any real serious intention of invading the UK, mostly because they were sane. they kind of looked at the situation and went, yeah, theoretically, with insert technological advancement here, whatever it was everyone was panicking about in the 19th century at various points, we theoretically could land a bunch of troops over in the UK. However, pretty much as your question pointed out, they very quickly realised that supplying said troops would be another matter entirely. Bear in mind, France had a fair number of ships in the 19th century, both war and merchant, so transporting everybody across the English Channel wouldn't be too much of a problem. The bigger problem would be, how do you conceal such a build-up of troops and shipping in such a way that the Royal Navy doesn't just come in and blow them all up anyway before you get a chance to launch your invasion? And then, assuming you launch your invasion, how do you stop the Royal Navy turning up and blowing up all your supply ships and transport ships and blockading the channel so that your troops in the UK are just left to starve? And having come to that conclusion, the French governments variously just kind of went, well, it's not really worth it, is it? There were French interventions in Europe, some successful, some less successful, but that all relied on the army going from point A to point B, and there was a nice, clear land-based logistical supply route, which was much easier to defend when you have one of, if not the largest armies in continental Europe, as compared to going across the Channel to try and fight somebody who has the largest and most powerful navy on the planet. Now, that's not to say that in various portions of the 19th century and the very early 20th century, the French didn't potentially contemplate the idea of going to war with Britain or the British Empire. But when they did, it was mostly through the lens of colonial wars. The British have or want this portion of the world that we'd rather they didn't have, or we would rather like for ourselves. And therefore, we're going to have a little bit of diplomatic tension, maybe a little bit of armed standoff with them, and it might escalate into a conflict, but a conflict over there. Because, apart from anything else, the Napoleonic Wars had shown the French just how utterly ruinous a knockdown, drag-out existentialist war with the British could be. And, of course, during the 19th century, you have the various other powers in Europe beginning to rise. At the beginning of the 19th century, Germany and Italy don't exist. There are a collection of small states. Towards the end of the 19th century, both Germany and Italy have manifested in, roughly speaking, the forms we're familiar with them today. And, of course, you have the Austrian Empire, which then becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on and so forth. And so for France, even if they wanted to get into a knockdown, drag-out fight with the UK and send a huge amount of troops over to try and conquer it, they knew pretty much for certainty, based on, again, historical precedent, that apart from fighting a holding action and cutting off their supplies, the other thing the British would do would just be to whistle up Prussia, or later Germany, or Italy, or anyone else on the continent with a grudge with France, which was a fairly long list, and just go, well, guys, all the French troops are over here now, and that means they're not in France. Anyone want to do some looting? And since they didn't want their country looted, it just was not worth it to French planners outside of theoretical exercises to try and plan any kind of invasion of Britain, because they were pretty sure it would go disastrously and horribly wrong. Ash the Lego Guy asks, what would you consider the most critical or dynamic naval theatre of World War II that isn't well covered or mentioned in popular history? I think I'd have to go with the Mediterranean, because, well, the Atlantic, the fight against the U-boats, Bismarck, etc., and to a certain degree, by extension, the Arctic, although the Arctic convoys did historically suffer from something of a lack of focus. But broadly speaking, that area of the world, that area of operations, has received an awful lot of coverage. More so, for perhaps obvious reasons, in the British sphere of academia than the American, whereas the flip side is, of course, the Pacific theatre against the Japanese has been examined in extreme detail by the American side of the academic sphere, and is still very well known in the UK, albeit obviously, in terms of the Atlantic and Pacific theatres, again, for obvious reasons, the Americans tend to focus on the Pacific, the British tend to focus on the Atlantic, but both sides are relatively aware of what was going on in the other ocean. The thing is, at that point, that unless you split off the Arctic convoys, which are very specifically convoys outside of fighting Scharnhorst in the Battle of Barents Sea, unless you split them off into their own section, the only other big theatres, I suppose, that you could look at would be the Indian Ocean, which, to be fair, doesn't really get looked at all that much, and the Mediterranean. Now, the reason I would pick the Mediterranean over the Indian Ocean is that whilst you do have things like Operation Sea, and then the Eastern Fleet, and then the British Pacific Fleet advances later on in the war, there's a couple of big Japanese cruiser raids into the Indian Ocean, there's some fairly important convoys obviously going back and forth, and all of that. The thing is, those operations are relatively spaced out, and they are local threats, but they never really develop into a full-scale, this could potentially tip the war one way or the other threat, although they could have done. Whereas the Mediterranean, although as a theatre of war it kind of runs down and begins to peter out in 1943 when the Italians call for an armistice, the Mediterranean is less looked at in both the British and American speaking worlds. It's not to say it's not looked at, but even when it is looked at, very specific elements tend to be looked at. The Malta convoys, the Battle of Cape Matapan, sometimes the evacuation of Crete, but there's the Dodecanese campaign, there's the Greek campaign, there's the more general Mediterranean Fleet campaign, there's the not massive, the not pedestal, vigorous harpoon Malta convoys. They don't tend to get so much of a look in. There's Force K, which is not a vitamin, but, you know, it's part of the whole Axis convoys going from Italy to North Africa, and Force K, the Royal Navy Force, trying to stop it, Force H in Gibraltar. There's a whole slew of things going on in the Mediterranean, and it, as you say in the question, it is incredibly dynamic. You've got everything from midget subs to battleships and aircraft carriers and everything in between going left, right, and centre. And it is actually quite critical, because it is sometimes said, perhaps by the less historically aware, that the North African campaign was a bit of a sideshow. Not really. Yes, numbers-wise, there may not have been quite as many troops committed as the Eastern Front, but you've got to look at what exactly was the North African campaign about, and it wasn't about who gets to control the Northern Sahara. It was about who gets to control the Suez Canal, and who gets to control, once they have control of the Suez Canal, who gets to either guard or take over what's now the Middle East, with its emerging oil industry and its strategic position, theoretically at least, to advance through towards British-controlled India, the Indian subcontinent. Obviously, they hadn't split it up into India and Pakistan and Bangladesh at that point. But it is actually a very vital fulcrum of operations, and there's also relatively little known supply routes to the USSR via the Middle East as well, which would have been cut off. So all of that, very, very important. Obviously doesn't happen because the British managed to hold the line along with their allies. But the Mediterranean, despite some various historians' best efforts, still remains kind of the red-headed stepchild of the big three naval theatres. Not helped at points by people's general dismissal of the Italian Navy, which you'll know from this channel is something I've been gradually trying to fight against. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, in honour of the 300th Drydock, and as a whimsy towards the film of the same name, can you give us a brief rundown of famous events involving ships named Sparta or Spartan? Well, there have been 6 vessels in the Royal Navy named Spartan, 2 of which saw a fair amount of combat. The first one, literally the first HMS Spartan, is the one you can see here. This was a frigate launched in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. Saw quite a bit of action initially fighting various French frigates, sometimes outnumbered. And then in the War of 1812, HMS Spartan was actually quite active raiding American shipping up and down the US East Coast and capturing a reasonable take of small American vessels. And then there's a whole run of Spartans during the 19th century, obviously gradually evolving in their capabilities. But since the Royal Navy isn't at war at that point, there's not a huge amount to say about them, at least in a 5-minute précis. Then, of course, you have the Dido-class HMS Spartan, which was one of the class that was completed with only 4 of its twin 5.25-inch guns. But she had quite a fun career, mostly shooting at the Luftwaffe, operating mostly in the Italian and Mediterranean theatres, Italian specifically because of the landings there, and which I actually covered in Guide 300. She did take a bit of a hit there. And she was actually sunk eventually operating off the Italian coast by an HS-293 glide bomb or guided missile. There's one other Spartan subsequent to her, which was a Swiftsure-class nuclear attack sub, but a fair amount of what she did is probably still classified. However, there was another vessel that pretty much has a similar name, but not Sparta or Spartan, but Spartiate or Spartiette, I don't know. Anyway, she was originally a French 74-gun third rate and was present at the Battle of the Nile. She was captured there, and then she was at the Battle of Trafalgar, now flying a British flag. So she fought in 2 of Nelson's big 3 battles, obviously on opposite sides in each one. And she actually had quite a long life. She was only broken up 3 years before Warrior was launched, having been at that point sailing around or sitting in harbour for well over half a century. The French appear to have had 1 or 2 other smaller ships which they named Spartiate, but they don't seem to have done all that much. And the US Navy actually also had a USS Spartan but that was a minesweeper in the First World War. Again, doesn't seem to have had a huge amount of service history, although apparently the Hulk might still be around somewhere in New York. Mark Griffiths asks, I just read a story about Nancy Bentley, who was recruited into the Royal Australian Navy at the age of 6 as a mascot to get around a regulation loophole so she could be treated for a snake bite on HMAS Sydney. Are you aware of other such instances where navies used creative loopholes in order to help people? Yeah, well, this happens perhaps more often than you'd think, but of course, circumventing the rules in order to help people, unfortunately, usually leads to bureaucrats identifying those loopholes and then closing them, which means that unless it's a very, very old story, a lot of the time they're not really published because the sailors actually have a vested interest in not helping the bureaucrats close those loopholes, which, of course, in turn means that by the time the story is old enough for the story to be published without causing too much drama, it depends on there being enough people still around who remember the story to publish it. So what I'm getting at is essentially, yes, there's a lot of unofficial stuff that is done to circumvent the rules, but actually finding it written down definitively in various sources is somewhat more difficult. But there are obviously examples, like you mentioned, Nancy Bentley enlisted so that she could be treated. Of course, you've got Just Nuisance, who was brought into the Royal Navy primarily to stop the railway company having a go at him. In some ways, a lot of the operations of the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron could be seen as exploiting a lot of loopholes despite opposition back home from certain vested interests in order to help stop the West African slave trade. That forms essentially two primary bodies of loophole evasion, one of which was that after the initial surge of anti-slavery operations, as said, the vested interest back in the UK who wanted slavery to continue, or in the UK's case, be brought back, they were very insistent that the Royal Navy should only stop ships which were flying the flags of countries that they were either at war with, which wasn't that many in the 1820s and 1830s, or they had specific treaties with which allowed them to inspect the ships, which of course meant that the slavers started flying various flags of governments with which the Royal Navy did not have a treaty in an attempt to get by it. The Royal Navy, of course, knew what was going on, but if they'd stuck to the letter of the law as laid down by these vested interest politicians, they wouldn't have been able to stop the slave ships. But the way it was worded was that you could board a ship if it was flying the flag of a ship you were allowed to, of a nation that you were allowed to board, or if you believed it to be flying said flag. And so suddenly, for a navy that prides itself on its, especially at that point, in its physical capabilities of its lookouts, huge numbers of Royal Navy lookouts and captains on the West Africa Squadron suddenly developed very situational cases of glaucoma. And honestly, we saw this ship, and honest gov, I honestly thought it was flying a flag of a nation that we could board. So we sailed right up to it and we boarded it, and we found some slaves. And of course, once we found slaves, we had to take them back and set them free. And the fact that they were flying a tennis court sized, let's say, American flag or whatever, everyone kind of ignored it because ultimately, the politicians back at home might have said, oh yes, well, clearly it would have been obvious it was flying a flag that didn't allow you to board it. But how were you going to prove that when everybody on the Royal Navy ship in question saw absolutely blind that no, it was definitely flying a flag which we could board? Willful ignorance at that point. And then similarly, in the immediate aftermath, once enough furor was caused to magically cure the short-sightedness of Royal Navy crews, then you have Captain Denham, who's a man I really need to do a video about specifically at some point, who was then charged, having been out on anti-slavery patrol for quite a while. He was then charged with coming up with rules and regulations to stop Royal Navy captains doing something like that. And at that point, he did possibly the most bureaucratic middle finger up at the vested interests groups that I can possibly think of, in that he wrote this really, really long book of regulations and said, yes, well, officially by law, we can only stop ships which we have a treaty with. But he did include in writing that line about, you can board ships if you believe that they are flying a flag of a nation that we have a treaty with. So there was still an excuse for the occasional bout of poor eyesight. But then, having written that officially we should only board ships which we have treaties with, or whose home nations we have treaties with, he then included a gargantuan section of appendixes, which was basically, and here are all the nations we happen to have begged, borrowed, or beaten into submission to have anti-slavery treaties with, which just so happened to be pretty much every single nation with an Atlantic coast, bar maybe one or two. So it was kind of like, yes, technically we can't board ships we don't have a treaty with, but we've managed to force almost everybody to have a treaty with us, so stuff you stupid politicians back at home. And I can't remember offhand where I read this, but I do recall at one point in the Napoleonic Wars, there was a British formation and they came across a ship, I believe it was a merchant vessel, that was sailing along and clearly needed assistance. But the frigate that was dispatched was told, if it's an enemy ship, take it as a prize. If it's not an enemy ship, then we have other pressing things to be getting on with. They went over, they found this merchant ship clearly in distress, but it was of a neutral party, at which point the captain went across the frigate, the Royal Navy frigate, went across in a boat, had a quick word with the captain of the merchant ship and said, look, really sorry, but we can't help you at the moment because you're a neutral ship and I've got orders that I can only deal with you in any way other than just checking up on you if you're a foreign hostile vessel. Of course, if you were flying a French or Spanish flag, we would have to take you as a prize. Nod, nod, wink, wink. Went back over to his boat, went back to his frigate, and then magically, the merchant ship hoisted, I believe it was a French flag, at which point the frigate fired, one gun across the bow, and the flag was duly hoisted down, and then the captain signaled back to the rest of the squadron, hey guys, guess what? This ship was actually French, so we've taken it as a prize, and now, since it's a prize and we want to preserve it, and prize money for everybody, we need to look after the crew and help them patch up so that the prize survives getting back to shore. And you're going to behave yourselves, aren't you, and head back to shore? Yep, great. Okay, fantastic. Okay, job done, and sailed off. Which was, rather flagrant, but rather amusing abuse of naval regulations, if I've ever seen one. I really have to dig up the book where I found that. John M. asks, Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Trowbridge was lost, as were over 900 men in 1807, when his flagship HMS Blenheim with escort HMS Java were lost off Madagascar. My questions are, Blenheim was old in quite bad repair, so bad, in fact, her captain had to essentially be shamed by Trowbridge into staying aboard even when he repeatedly pointed out her unseaworthiness. Trowbridge was reportedly a good officer, knowledgeable and most able. Surely he could see she was no longer fit to serve. And even after being offered any other ship available, he went with her. Why? What compelled him to take a ship that bad to her doom when no pressing issue demanded that she sail straight away? And also, was he a forebear of Admiral Ernest C. Trowbridge? So the last part of that question, yes, he was the great-grandfather of Admiral Ernest C. Trowbridge. So the Admiral Trowbridge of World War I was a direct descendant of Thomas Trowbridge. Now, it does seem a very odd set of circumstances because Thomas Trowbridge, as you noted, was not a poor officer. He was one of Nelson's band of brothers. He fought with Nelson at St. Vincent and at the Nile. So it does seem very out of character for him. Obviously, it is a bit of a mystery because everybody involved went down with their ships. The only ship to survive was the Harrier, which is the ship you can see in the foreground here. The only two conclusions I can come up with that potentially make a degree of sense based on what evidence we do have is, one, possibly Trowbridge just didn't believe Blenheim was in that bad a condition. Royal Navy captains exaggerating the state of their ships in order to not go on a particular mission was not unheard of. It wasn't common, but for someone of Trowbridge's experience, he would have run across that kind of incident once or twice before. So it's entirely possible that he just didn't believe Blenheim was in that bad a state, considering that most of the issues that Blenheim appears to have had dealt with underwater damage in a hold, which is not somewhere that Trowbridge would necessarily have gone, but obviously the captain would be much more aware of. So he could have just made a straight-up mistake. The other potential issue, which also obviously, Trowbridge obviously made a mistake by insisting that Blenheim continue on this voyage, but the other potential reason for the mistake is the stress and degree of demands that were being placed on officers. Because whilst the Royal Navy did have a fairly large cadre of good officers, they also had a very large and expanding navy, and so the absolute best officers were at a premium, and they were often driven quite literally from pillar to post and not really given much of a let-up because, well, who was going to replace them? You could replace them with an officer, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to replace them with as good an officer. And you see that with, people like poor old Collingwood. So he's the other British admiral in charge of the other column at Trafalgar. He's an exceptional officer in his own right, but because of his survival at Trafalgar and his success, he's essentially kept out at sea until he's dying 5 years later, and never actually manages to make it back to the UK because he dies when the Admiralty says, finally, you can come home, and he dies en route home. And it's possible, bearing in mind Trowbridge is not at the Battle of Trafalgar, because after the Nile he is kind of sent off on his own career, it's entirely possible that perhaps Trowbridge has just been run constantly for years and years ago, trying to shore up Britain's defences at various points across the planet. He may have just been under so much stress that essentially his mental capacity just went, no, I've been ordered to go from point A to point B in ship X, and I'm just going on that ship, and we'll deal with everything else when we get there. I'm not dealing with anything else at this stage. Basically burnout. And that might have then caused him to reject the advice of pretty much everyone from the ship's captain all the way up to the station commander, who technically outranked him. But either way, it ended up with the ship going under in a storm. Jim Smitty asks, in 1906, when HMS Dreadnought was commissioned, she displaced just under 21,000 tons at deep load and just over 18,000 tons at standard. Fast forward 10 years, when the Admiral class were laid down, the displacement of capital ships had more than doubled, with Hood coming in around 46,500 tons. And when the Washington Naval Treaty put an end to all of the post-World War I design capital ships, they were coming in at 42 to 50,000 ton displacement figures, with the N3s, G3s, South Dakotas, Lexingtons, Keys, number 13s, etc. Even the German L-20E Alpha design was in this displacement range. Given the rapid growth of capital ship design in such a short time frame, how large would capital ships have grown had it not been for the Washington Naval Treaty capping everybody at 35,000 tons? Say, in 1930, would we be seeing Yamato and Montana-sized ships as the new standard, i.e. 60 to 70,000 ton displacement? And by 1940, would we see something akin to the Tillman 4.2s be the then standard? And finally, what would be the upper limits on how large capital ships could get before engineering problems started showing up and ships started breaking under their own weight? I think it would have grown in stages, because in the 1920s, certainly at the beginning of the 1920s, you have various advances that have been coming about from the late 1910s and are now seeing more and more widespread adoption. So the first runs of small tube boilers and so forth, which mean you can either get more power in the same machinery space or the same power in less machinery space, as well as various other advances in electronics, electrohydraulics, etc., etc. So I think what would happen is during the bulk of the 1920s, displacement probably wouldn't rise too much compared to the South Dakotas, N3s, G3s, etc., for two primary reasons. Firstly, you're talking about ships which, for the most part, carrying 16-inch guns, with the exception of the N3s, but are also mostly fairly heavily armoured. But the expansion of displacement by a significant degree tends to come about either because armament's gone up radically or speed has gone up radically. I don't think the propulsion technology is there to take either a 12-gun ship like South Dakota or an 18-inch gunship like N3 and move them at significant velocities without drastically cutting into some other form of vital statistic, like with the number 13s. Not really particularly well protected. Although you could do it, obviously, because they drew up that design. And so with those limitations in mind, I think they probably would have looked at still having your battleship, i.e. sub 25 knots, and your battle cruiser 30 plus knots, or thereabouts. And I think the main emphasis would have been on tweaking the design, so granting them more armour to withstand 16 or even 18-inch gunfire, and playing around with the armament layout. So perhaps a follow-on to the South Dakota 1920s might have looked at heavier armour whilst retaining the same guns, and then a subsequent follow-on to that might have looked at 8 or 9 18-inch guns instead of 12 16-inch guns, for example. So the displacement might have crept up to, comfortably over 50,000 tons, or maybe 54 to 56,000 tons. But unless and until somebody develops particularly propulsion technology to a degree where you could actually get a fast battleship in the way that we'd understand it in the 1930s, i.e. something capable of 27, 28 knots, whilst retaining at least a decent amount of armour as well as firepower, then you're not going to get a big jump. The G3s, yes, they have good armour, they have good speed, they have good firepower, even by World War II standards of what actually happened in history, but by the standards of the early 1920s, they have, quote-unquote, only 9 guns, whereas the battleships either have 18-inch guns or they have 10 or 12 16-inch guns. But I think certainly by the early 1930s, maybe not 1930 itself, but maybe by 33 to 35, you would probably see ships then sitting at 60 to 70,000 tons, and you'd have this merger started probably by the number 13s and the G3s into a fast capital ship design. Although with the pressures of some pretty hefty battle cruisers around, you might actually see it delayed slightly, because the fast capital ship might be seen as needing to go 29 to 30 knots, which would still be slower than a G3 or some of the other ships like the Lexingtons, but fast enough to mostly negate the battle cruiser's speed advantage, whereas 27, 28 knots might be seen as, well, these bigger, nastier battle cruisers might still have a significant speed advantage over you, which they could exploit. And of course, if you want that greater speed, you need more machinery, which would push the displacement up a fair bit. But as I've also said previously, I think when you're looking at ships of 80 to 90,000 tons, give or take a little bit, that's pretty much where things are going to cap out. Partly because people are going to have to invest absolutely massively in extensive upgrades to their infrastructure, dry docks, slipways, cranes, etc., just to be able to handle and build these colossal vessels, which you're going to be pushing 900 to 1,000 feet on the faster ones, if not more. But also you're going to hit the upper limit of what's possible gun-wise. And again, I've said in the past, I think an 18-inch gun in an unlimited build scenario, an 18-inch gun with the technology up to, let's say, the mid-1930s, is probably about as big as you can realistically go. You could build larger guns. I'm not saying it's physically impossible, but the reduction in number of guns and the reduction in rate of fire would be far too great to have such weapons on anything other than the most experimental vessels. Because ultimately, if you have, like, incomparable 6 20-inch guns, okay, great, fantastic, you can hit stuff really, really hard, but a similar hull with 9 18-inch guns can hit stuff almost as hard, and practically speaking, in terms of what armor you could realistically put to sea, is going to have probably about the same chance at reasonable battle ranges of penetrating the enemy armor plating, except they're going to be firing faster and there's half again as many guns. So I think there would be a stabilization at somewhere between 70 and 85,000 tons, just because the investment needed to build bigger ships than that would be mind-bogglingly large, and you wouldn't get a huge amount of extra rate of return at that point, because if you could in theory build a 120, 140,000 ton ship with a dozen 18-inch guns, but for the price of that ship, your opponent could probably build a pair of 75,000 tonners, each armed with 9 18-inch guns, so they collectively have more 18-inch guns than you. There's 2 of them. They can go in 2 different places at once, and they're probably about as well protected. Greb asks, during the time frame of 1940 to 45, if you had to design a battleship but with the smallest caliber main guns possible, how low do you think you could go and still be competitive? Well, my baseline answer would be at reasonable battle ranges, which, as you know, I kind of define as mid to high 20,000s of yards as your outer starting point and then decreasing down. Does the gun have the capability of penetrating most of the armor that I'm going to come across? Now, yes, you can, and people did engage at longer distances than that, but realistically speaking, even with radar-directed fire control, such as it was in the latter part of World War II, you're really stretching it to hit something much beyond about 26 to 28,000 yards. You can do so, but against a moving target that's capable of doing its own maneuvering, you're going to expend colossal amounts of ammunition to get even that one hit. So it's just not worth it. So, yes, in theory, a bigger gun that could penetrate 15 inches of armor at 35,000 yards might sound good on paper, but you're really not going to be using that. I mean, apart from anything else, apart from scoring a hit at 35,000 yards, that's one thing, but scoring a hit on a bit of armor that you actually could then use the penetration on is another thing entirely. Statistically, you're probably going to hit something that's not particularly well armored, at which point the smaller shell would be just as useful. There's a slight changes in bursting charge aside. So at that point, you have to look at, well, what kind of armor am I probably going to encounter? And without getting into shenanigans about how Littorio's armor system may or may not have worked, outside of Yamato, you're looking at maybe 15 inches of slab armor for if your foe is like a King George V, or you're looking at 12 to 13 inches of armor, possibly inclined, possibly not. So in terms of effective armor thickness, you want a gun that has a decent chance of getting through maybe 14 to 15 inches of apparent thickness of armor at about 25,000 yards. Now, of course, your battle doctrine might call for you to engage at much closer ranges, like British battle doctrine, and in those circumstances you could go with an even smaller gun still, but we're talking about an ideal case here rather than a specific case. You could potentially get away with a smaller gun, but in an absolute ideal circumstance, the smallest gun would probably be the French 13-inch gun, as seen on the Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Now, it is given a armor penetration value at just over 25,000 yards of just under 13.5 inches of armor, which isn't quite our absolute golden ideal, but it's pretty good. And once you start drawing in, because we said 25,000 yards-ish is quite extreme. Once you start drawing in much closer than that into the area where you're realistically actually going to get most hits, then that kind of penetration as it scales up is going to be more than sufficient. The German 11-inch guns, as found on the Scharnhorst, just do not have the penetration at that distance. There's a good margin in the high teens to low 20s of thousands of yards where battleships could routinely expect to hit each other, where the Scharnhorst 11-inch guns just aren't going to get through a good chunk of treaty battleship armor protection. And before anyone starts jumping up and down and asking about what about the Alaska's 12-inch guns, well, for one thing, they're very much towards the very end of the period. And, you know, in 1940, you're not going to have access to them. But also, at 25,000 yards, the Alaska's guns have 10.5 inches of penetration. Now, that's pretty good for what they are, but bearing in mind the kind of opposition we said we're up against, and we're talking obviously about ideal broadside circumstances, the Alaska's 12-inch guns are really only getting to a point where they can reliably penetrate most treaty battleships' armor belts in the 15 to 16,000 yard region, once you take into account angling or just sheer thickness, at which point there's a fair distance, you know, the 15 to 20,000, maybe just over 20,000 yard range, where your own guns aren't really going to be doing all that much to your opposition's armoured portions, and their guns potentially could. So based on all of that, I would say your minimum price for entry to be competitive as a battleship in World War II is probably going to be the French 13-inch. HMS Inappropriate asks, I understand the purpose of a Razee ship was to reduce top weight by removing the uppermost gun deck while maintaining the rest of the ship's attributes, resulting in a ship that is faster and has better seakeeping than the original. So, two related questions. First, would it be fair to say the relationship between a Razee and the original ship is similar to that between a battlecruiser and a battleship, i.e. the former sacrifices armament to gain speed over the latter? And second, were any ships designed and constructed from scratch to be the equivalent to a Razee, i.e. a big frigate that had the hull strength and rigging of a two-decker? On the first point, broadly speaking, yes. It's a little bit of a difficult one in detail because, of course, back in the Age of Sail, you had multiple different weights of cannon shot and therefore different size guns on different gun decks, but they were all part of the ship's main battery, and a Razee lost the lighter guns. It still retained its heavy guns, so for the 64 gunners that were Razeed, they retained 24-pounder gun decks, and for the 74s that were Razeed, they retained 32-pounder gun decks, which were, you know, the big heavy hitters. They lost some of the lighter weapons up top, which is not directly analogous to battle cruisers and battleships, because at that point in the Age of Steam and Steel, you have just the big guns, so you're talking about fewer big guns, rather than the direct equivalent would be less secondary guns, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But from a very broad perspective, yes, you could say a Razee is kind of a battle cruiser version of a ship of the line in the Age of Sail. Now, in terms of did any big frigates get designed specifically with the hull strength and rigging of a two-decker, i.e. full ship of the line spec, I'm not sure. However, a number of big frigates, 50, 58, 60 gun frigates, that were designed and built in the very latter stages of the War of 1812, i.e. 1814, 1815, and subsequently in the early parts of the peace that followed the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, were designated by the Royal Navy as fourth rates, and that's the smallest rate of ship of the line. So in theory, they should have carried framing and masts and sails commensurate with that role, but more proportional to there being a small capital ship that just happened to have a frigate-like gun deck arrangement, rather than specifically taking a full third rates mast and rigging and setting those up. So they would have been kind of a halfway house, I suppose. Nicholas Ressar asks, in a fight between all British battleships of all time and all United States battleships of all time, who would win? It seems like the Americans would have a slight advantage in more late-built battleships, but I don't know if that would be enough to overcome the British numbers advantage. Well, I think it depends how far back you want to go with the definition battleship. Looking at the pre-Dreadnought side of things, it's not even funny. It's the Royal Navy, even if you're being extremely generous in defining pre-Dreadnought battleship, the Royal Navy still outnumbers the US contingent by approximately 2-1. So they're going to win that one. The flip side, of course, is that outside of pinning someone against a coast and ramming or self-destructing right alongside, pre-Dreadnoughts against the more modern fast battleships are essentially a non-entity, so we can move on from that. Then in the sort of World War I period stuff, you're looking at the British have something like over a 10-ship advantage, so they're definitely going to pull off that one. And that leaves you with the World War II period ships. Now, this is where the British do have a disadvantage, because you have the 5 King George V's plus Vanguard, so 6 ships in total. And on the US side, of course, you have 10, including the 4 Iowas. Now, if you were to take the 5 King George V's plus Vanguard up against the 2 North Carolinas and 4 South Dakotas, that would be an interesting fight, because, of course, the American ships carry 16-inch guns, so they have a heavier armament as opposed to the 14 and 15-inch guns of the British ships. But the British ships are, if you average everything out, very slightly faster. Vanguard's obviously considerably faster, and at reasonable battle ranges, the British ships are somewhat better protected. And yes, I know the American ships do have inclined armour, but still, if you actually work out the math at reasonable battle ranges, the British do have a slight edge there. But of course, the elephant in the room is the Iowas, because there are 4 of them. They're very fast, very heavily armed. Admittedly, their armour protection isn't massively better or worse than the South Dakotas. And in all of this, we haven't factored in for the British battlecruisers, which the Americans don't have any of. But I think essentially what it would boil down to is how quickly would the North Carolina, South Dakota, Iowa combination be able to grind down the British, and what would the British do in response? Because if I was in charge of the British fleet, given the massive numerical superiority I have in the World War I and immediate post-World War I fleet scenario, I might be tempted to pull Renown, Repulse, and Hood, leave the 13.5 and 12-inch battle cruisers back with the World War I lot, but pull the 3 15-inch battle cruisers and possibly Nelson and Rodney and stick them in with my fleet, or possibly, instead of Nelson and Rodney, get Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Warspite, the refitted QEs. Now, some of you might be saying, well, that's just adding additional punching bags, but it's also adding additional guns, and at reasonable battle ranges, those guns, whether they be the 16-inch or the 15-inch, can reach out and hurt American ships pretty well, as well as, yes, it is providing the US with more targets. Now, Hood and Renown and Repulse's survival odds, if they come under concentrated fire from the US ships, they're not going to last that long. But if, for sake of argument, let's say I pulled the 3 refitted QEs, and so now my British battle line has gone up to 9 ships, I'm still going to win the World War I fight by a fair landslide. I've left Nelson and Rodney out just because they're a little bit slower, and I have Renown, Repulse, and Hood. So now my battle line is up to 12 ships. I now have a 2-ship numerical advantage. And at that stage, the British battle line is at a disadvantage, firepower and armour-wise, but they have an overall, as I say, 2-ship advantage, which they can then try and mob up on at least one American ship, maybe, mob up on the North Carolinas or something like that. At which point it basically becomes a scenario of, can the, on average, superior American World War II contingent grind down my modified British World War II-ish battle line quickly enough that Nelson, Rodney, the other QEs, the Revenges, and various other survivors from the heavier end of the World War II battle line won't be able to reach in time to help and assist. Because if the British World War II-ish battle line can hold out long enough and maybe inflict enough damage that those other ships, especially Nelson and Rodney, can come up and help, then sheer numerical advantage, and as I said, at those kind of gun ranges, both sides can hurt each other, should force this one area that the Americans have the advantage in to break off at least. But it is also possible that if the Americans get a few good hits in early, then cripple and destroy 2 or 3 of the British ships before they take massive damage to any of their own, particularly looking at obviously Renown and Repulse, then at that stage they might be able to finish off either all or a good portion of the British World War II-ish battle line before any help can arrive, and by the time help does arrive, well, then they're just feeding what's left. So, it could go either way. The Americans do have a slight advantage at that upper end. It's essentially down to who engages what at that upper end and how long do they last relative to how do those smaller battles resolve themselves. Sapper Ninja asks, my own area of expertise is firearms and ballistics, and as such there's something that's always piqued my interest. Small arms cartridge ammunition started using bottlenecked designs where the chamber has a larger diameter than the bore as early as the 1860s. Bottleneck designs offer many improvements over straight wall chambers. Why was it not widely used on large caliber naval guns? Well, it depends how far up the scale you're willing to go, because at the small to medium calibers of naval guns, which are still obviously quite hefty from a land-based perspective, there is a small degree of it going on, as you can see here with this shell diagram. However, I suspect that the reason it didn't really kick off in the big guns, the battleship guns, for example, there would be a few different ones. Firstly, of course, bottlenecking allows you to get a lot more bang behind the shell. Now, for battleship guns, the idea of getting a lot more propellant in behind the shell, whilst it could be attractive in some respects when you're trying to make high-velocity guns, as we've seen in previous questions, the velocity of the gun is as much, if not more, dependent on the length of the gun barrel when you get to heavy caliber naval artillery, as opposed to exactly how much propellant you're sticking behind it, although you can put a bit more if you want the speed as well. But then you have issues with the guns whipping, you have issues with overstabilization or shells becoming unstable. There are all sorts of issues once you start to push very big, very heavy armor-piercing shells past certain speeds. And so some of the major advantages of being able to stick a whole bunch more propellant in behind the shell aren't really advantages at that scale, because there's a certain speed beyond which it's not really that advisable to go. And that's before we get into things like barrel erosion and so forth. Another issue, perhaps on a more practical level, would be actually feeding the ammunition into the gun, because obviously with a small caliber firearm you have the bullet and the cartridge all as one piece, so it all feeds in, and the mass and the hardness of the brass and the copper or the lead or whatever are such that the machined steel can easily withstand you feeding that in however you want to do it. Whereas on a battleship grade thing, you're talking about armor piercing caps and windscreens and so forth, so you can't afford to have a really nice big chamber with a smaller barrel at the end of it, which you feed the shell into, because if you feed the shell in absolutely precisely, fantastic, but if you feed it ever so slightly off, a shell that weighs over a ton with a armor piercing cap and a windscreen, well, you're either going to pinch and bend or crush the windscreen if you're ever so slightly off, which is going to compromise its aerodynamics, or if the armor-piercing cap engages, you might end up chipping bits out of the gun barrel, if it's ever so slightly misaligned. So you'd be damaging either the shell or the gun if you're ramming at high speed this 1 to 2 ton shell, and it is ever so slightly off and clip something, which is relatively likely to happen considering that the ship's pitching and rolling and so forth. And if you were to install a bunch of heavy-duty guide rails, perhaps, to guide the shell in through the larger chamber and into the main barrel, then you might be able to avoid that problem, but you'd end up with a very heavy-duty set of guide rails which are now in the breech, which you now have to extract in some manner to hold outside of the gun whilst you then feed in the charges and close the breech up, etc., which takes up volume, takes up space, makes it far more mechanically complex, and as we covered, probably the extra charge isn't giving you all that much of an advantage, considering that at this point with major caliber guns you're talking about charge bags rather than a full brass cartridge. Even the German Krupp guns, the brass charge is the back end, it's not linked directly to the shell. So essentially it's more trouble than it's worth as far as I can tell for the really big guns. Brian Smith asks, the US Navy standards all had 4 turret designs. The modern fast battleships that were built all had 3 turret designs. Was the change made for any reason other than to save weight after the naval treaties? Yes, the change came in for a few other reasons. I mean, you look at treaty ships, well, ships that were built in the treaty period that weren't limited by the treaties, like the Littorios, admittedly cheating, trying to pretend to be treaty ships, and the Yamatos, very definitely not constrained by treaties. They also went for 3 turret designs. And some of it comes down to just efficiency. If you've got 9 guns that can penetrate both current and what you think are going to be near future threats, then those guns are going to be relatively heavy. So carrying a dozen of them would impose penalties on other portions of your ship, specifically your speed and protection, that you might not want, and 9 guns is still a decent enough broadside, so let's go with that. But also you've got the fact that by the time you get to modern fast battleships, fast clue in the name, they're aiming to get 27, 28 knots or faster. Now, even with advances in propulsion technology, more efficient high temperature boilers, high pressure boilers, etc., the amount of space you need to devote to your machinery plant to get up to 27, 28, 30, 33 knots is still somewhat greater than you'd need proportionally for a machinery plant of a ship that's only going 21 to 23 knots. And thus, where's that space going to come from? Well, you can either make your ship absolutely massive, in which case you're going to end up with a very expensive ship you can only build in a few locations, or you have to sacrifice something. And if your baseline design before used 10 or 12 guns in the US Navy's case, then, well, if you go down to 9 guns, as we said, 9 guns is still perfectly acceptable, assuming you have a heavy enough gun, and some of that space is then going to be taken up by machinery. And bearing in mind you have to protect the guns, the magazines, and the machinery, adding another turret, 4th turret, not only means the ship is longer to fit the turret, but the citadel is longer to protect that turret and its magazines, all of which increases weight, which means you need more machinery, which makes the ship bigger, and so on and so forth in a big recursive loop upwards. It's somewhat telling that when you look at the Montana, just how much extra weight and size you have to add to that ship just to add a 4th triple turret with 16-inch 50s in it, and even then you're still having to downgrade the speed compared to the Iowas for the eventual Montana design. Or if you look at the Longtana design, it gets to truly ridiculous proportions. Jonathan Smith asks, I'm wondering if Dreadnought or later battleships, or maybe monitors, ever used reduced propellant charges for shore bombardment, for example to get a steeper fall angle at short range, and did their firing tables or fire control computers include support for that? Yes, they absolutely did use reduced charges for shore bombardment where they could, but the primary role of the reduced charge was actually just to reduce barrel wear, because of course it's mostly the energy, the pressure being generated by the propellant that causes most, not all, but most of the barrel wear. And so if you're only firing over a 3, 4, 5 mile distance, you only need the gun to lob the shell that far, so you can use less propellant, extends your barrel life. Now, it was noted during shore bombardment operations, particularly in the Pacific, that with the reduced charges obviously leading to a higher arc for a given distance, it was then possible to engage targets on the reverse side of a slope using reduced charges, where a full charge wouldn't be able to because the angle of fall would be too shallow. So that was taken into account. And yes, the firing tables and fire control computers did have settings for this. But also, interestingly enough, the Iowa class had a reduced charge set that was designed to give the 16-inch 50 gun the ballistics of a 16-inch 45 caliber gun if you wanted to fire the Mark 8 shells at long range for deck penetration, because at the outer edge of realistic battle ranges, they realised that because the 16-inch 50 fired with a higher muzzle velocity, a shell that hit the deck would hit a shallower angle, and so compared to a 16-inch 45, which actually means the 16-inch 45 has better deck penetration at long range than the 16-inch 50. And so they said, oh, okay, well, we'll come up with a reduced charge paradigm, plug that into the fire control computer, and so at extreme distances where you're trying to get deck hits rather than belt hits, the 16-inch 50 would then fire obviously with a reduced muzzle velocity. The Mark 8 shell then has the ballistics as if it's fired out of a 16-inch 45 caliber gun and is more likely to penetrate the enemy. Anton Alert asks, this may be a very basic question 5 years into the channel, but how do torpedoes, well, work? Do they pierce the hull and then explode, much like an armor-piercing shell? Or is it direct contact, once I stop I go boom scenario? And furthermore, is the explosion just the tip of the iceberg, with water pressure being a contributor to the damage? And related, why is it that the plume of water always goes upwards after a torpedo or any other underwater explosion? With the latter part, it's simply the path of least resistance. When a torpedo explodes in the water, if you very crudely consider the directions the explosion has to go as a cube, or any other kind of underwater explosion for that matter, broadly speaking, obviously unless it's in direct contact with a ship, if the explosion goes down, left, right, forward, back, then in all those cases there is effectively, as far as the torpedo is concerned, a near infinite amount of water resisting this. Obviously, it's not actually infinite, but for the purposes of the explosion, it might as well be. Whereas whether the torpedo or mine is 10, 20, 30 foot, 50 foot down, or even in the case of depth charges several hundred feet down, the path straight up is absolutely the path of least resistance. And you might think, well, what about if the water that the explosion takes place in is shallow enough that, particularly in case of a depth charge, the seabed may be closer than the surface? But the thing is, obviously, the seabed is, generally speaking, solid, so it is also quite resistive, whereas air is much less resistive, and therefore the greatest effect of the explosion is seen going upwards. I mean, if you see an explosion occurring underwater, perhaps in a small-scale test rig in a tank or something, you'll see that the explosion itself forms a sphere of disturbed water, but all the water pressure on all other sides collapses all that back in, which, increases the effect going upwards even more, because there isn't an effectively infinite stack of water above resisting, and so a huge amount of energy is displaced upwards. Now, as regards the torpedo, when it hits a ship, in theory, the detonator should work fast enough that the torpedo strikes the ship and it explodes. However, due to placement of the warhead, placement of the detonator, nature of the impact, delay on the fuse, etc., at times, torpedoes can end up penetrating the ship's hull before detonating. This is not a deliberate effect of a torpedo going off, but it can be relatively useful. And bear in mind, a torpedo might be 1.5, 2.5, 3 tons or more, depending on the time period. And if that hits you, a big lump of metal, let's say weighing 2 tons, hits you doing 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, depending on the torpedo, that's going to cause a fair bit of damage. I mean, you're talking about, a torpedo that weighs about as much as a large pickup truck or a small actual truck, and compressed into a much smaller package, therefore much more dense, hitting you at kind of low-grade highway speeds. If all that's standing in the way of that is an inch or less of steel plating, that plating's going to cave, and the torpedo's going to end up partially into the ship. But, as I say, that's just a happy accident if it does happen. Essentially what happens when the torpedo explodes is, well, let's assume it explodes on contact. Now, once more, you have an explosion, and again, it's paths of least resistance. The absolute path of least resistance is, of course, as we said, up into the air, but the secondary path of least resistance is into the ship, because although you do have some solid steel plate stopping you, the resistive value of that half-inch, 3/4 inch, inch and a half of steel plate is much, much less than the resistive value of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of feet of water in almost every other direction. and therefore explosion gets sort of directed into the ship as well as vertically, and it's a lot of explosive. I mean, torpedoes, you're talking about hundreds of pounds of explosive being carried to their target. And then, of course, behind that steel plate, depending on how you've set up your torpedo defenses, but there will usually be a void space. Sometimes it's filled with liquid, but if it is, then there'll be a void space behind that. But essentially, you have liquid void layers, which will try and dissipate the force of the impact. But because there is void spaces there, it is a less resistive path for the explosion to take, and therefore it will. And I'm sure, someone will point out that, well, isn't steel more resistive than water just in terms of rigidity? Again, compared to water, yes. But again, as I said, when you look at the explosion in water, if you look at, again, a scale one, you'll see that the water pulses back and then comes back in again. Steel can't do that. So it will pulse out, maybe not as far as the water will in the surrounding bit of the explosion, but it will still be, pushed back, ripped apart, etc., several feet, possibly several dozen feet, and then because it doesn't come back, then there is now a hole. Now, on top of that, of course, once the explosion starts to collapse in on itself from the surrounding water pressure, then much like you get that plume of water going up, you will get a degree of a plume of water forcing its way into the ship, which will exacerbate any remaining barely hanging on there bits of the ship's hull or torpedo defense system, which isn't going to help. But the largest problem at that stage is that if a ship is moving, then you have a constant flow of water coming past the ship, and now you have a constant flow of water coming into the ship through a big hole in its side, and any sort of relatively minor water jet that might be produced by the torpedo exploding is going to be dwarfed in overall impact on the ship's durability by the fact you'll have several hundred or several thousand tons of water moving at 20, 25, 30 knots, depending on how fast your ship is going at the time, pressing in on what's left of your torpedo defense system and bulkheads, which is why ships have to slow down very quickly once they get hit by torpedoes. Otherwise, bulkheads and so forth start failing and flooding starts spreading. PH5817 asks, if armour for a warship was often specified as able to resist her own shells, how was splinter-proofing specified? Was it to resist a splinter from her own gun or the kinetic energy of a given arbitrary splinter? This was much more of an arbitrary rule of thumb situation than varying specifically from ship to ship, because splinters could come from all sorts of things. Splinters effectively being what on land you might call shrapnel, so they could be bits of your own hull and superstructure propelled by explosions, or bits of the casing of the bomb or shell that has just hit you. And of course that could be a 250-pound bomb, it could be a 500-pound bomb, it could be a 1,000-pound bomb, it could be a 4-inch shell, it could be a 6-inch shell, it could be a 16-inch shell. So trying to specify splinter-proofing against any specific threat that might generate splinters was pretty much a hiding to nothing. And of course, the splinter generated by a 4-inch shell detonating 3 feet away from you might penetrate an amount of metal that a splinter generated by a 16-inch shell detonating 400 feet away from you, or a 2,000-pound bomb detonating 500 feet away from you, might not penetrate. So generally speaking, splinter proofing was seen as a thickness of material, obviously usually metal, though in the case of HMS Stuart here you can see they put padding around the bridge as well, which will stop most flying shards of metal experienced in naval warfare that hit you at a distance whereby the blast of the weapon in and of itself is unlikely to actually do significant damage to you. Now that's a slightly long-winded way of saying it, but essentially what it amounted to is, if something explodes and the blast isn't so close that the blast itself is going to rip whatever it is, in this case let's say a bridge, to pieces, then you can usually expect the fragments resulting therefrom to have approximately to within the same order of magnitude a similar amount of energy, unless they're really, really big splinters or something like that, at which point there'd be a rule of thumb of, well, roughly this much material will resist most of those splinters, and it usually worked out at being about an inch thick of high-grade steel, whether that be particularly high-grade construction steel or low-grade homogeneous armor-grade steel, but most people seem to settle on an inch thickness as the minimum for splinter-proofing, almost regardless of what came through. So as I said, a close-range hit from a 2,000-pound bomb or a 15 or 16-inch shell and a particularly large splinter from that would still go through splinter-proof plating, but 98-99% of splinters would be kept back. Don't Look Down the Barrel of a Loaded Cannon asks, I love logistics. How many times can a World War II carrier, say an Essex, send out a maximum effort strike before they ran out of torpedoes, bombs, or aviation fuel without resupply? So for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to assume that the carrier is sending out a Sunday punch, which is 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers, and we're assuming they're going to use Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers. So starting off with aviation fuel, by default, an Essex class can carry 908,900 litres of fuel. And if we assume maximum effort means they're going a reasonable distance, but they're not completely loading up on fuel tanks, so we're giving the Avengers the 2 slipper tanks, but not filling the internal bomb bay. We're sticking a couple of small external fuel tanks on the Helldivers and a single external fuel tank on the Hellcats. So that means that you need just over 144,000 litres of fuel per full strike. Now, of course, they are going to come back with some fuel aboard, and we are ramping things up a little bit by having them carrying some external fuel. But based on those figures, assuming they drained every single drop of fuel, you'd be able to make 6 full-scale strikes with your Sunday punch before you ran out of fuel aboard the carrier. Well, you would still have enough for about 30% of another strike, but obviously that's not a full strike. Now, as I said, obviously, between the fact that the aircraft are going to have some fuel left when they come back on board, and you wouldn't necessarily always be making a strike with that many external tanks, you might extend that to 7 or 8 full strikes. But even if you go with purely the internal fuel load, so no external fuel tanks at all, you can get 9 strikes using your Sunday punch based on the aviation fuel capacity. Now, for ammunition, it's a little bit harder because finding exact figures for precisely how many Mark 13 torpedoes, exactly how many bombs, exactly how many rounds of ammunition the Essex class carried is a little bit more difficult. However, Norman Friedman comes to the rescue by mentioning that in its default configuration, an Essex class was designed to carry 625 tons of aviation ammunition, as opposed to total ammunition storage capacity, which of course includes 20mm, 40mm, and 5-inch rounds. Now, making some broad assumptions, if we assume that the Avengers are each carrying a torpedo plus ammunition for their guns, and the Helldivers are carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs plus ammunition for their guns, and the Hellcats are carrying 1,000 pounds of bombs, whether that be a single 1,000-pounder or 2 500-pounders, whatever, plus ammunition for their guns, that returns a value of just over 8 fully loaded strikes until you've basically run your munitions out. You'd have about half a strike's worth of ammunition left over, and this is, of course, going purely by weight. For things like torpedoes, you might run out of those considerably faster, but of course, Avengers can also carry bombs, and you might be able to eke that out a bit more if you load your Hellcats purely for strafing, and maybe they just have machine guns and some rocket pods on instead of bombs. That'll save you more bombs for your Helldivers and possibly your Avengers when you run out of torpedoes. But if you average it all out, it looks like, roughly speaking, if you were to make something approximating a full effort strike with your Sunday punch off an Essex class, you're probably going to be able to launch about 7 to 8 strikes before you run out of something. And towards the end of those, you may be having to choose, a bunch of 500-pound bombs instead of 1,000-pound bombs, or bombs instead of torpedoes and stuff like that. And then you'll have a reserve left. As I say, it does vary depending on exactly how much fuel, exactly how much ammunition, what kind of ammunition you put in. But I'd say 7 to 8 would be a roughly decent estimate. Jeffrey Conley asks, in a recent dry dock you mentioned how destroying the timber supply was considered as big or possibly even a bigger hit to a navy than losing a capital ship in the Age of Sail. My question is, during said period, when during wartime was a country's timber supply hit the hardest by a foreign power coming in and destroying everything, and what were some of the top 3 ramifications of it? Well, burning the timber supplies of a nation was actually relatively rare for a few reasons. Firstly, of course, because it has such strategic value, they were incredibly heavily guarded and tended to be in ports, which themselves were very heavily guarded. Secondly, of course, most major countries had more than one port, so just because you burned one port didn't necessarily mean you'd burn the timber supplies for everyone, just for the supplies for that port. And thirdly, if you were in a position where you could just rock up and set fire to a particular nation's port, maybe their major naval infrastructure, and burn all their timber supplies, you were probably in such a position of dominance that you were going to win the war outright, and thus any knock-on effects of the burning of the timber supplies were probably not going to be noticed within the larger parameters of that nation very rapidly and immediately losing the war. But with that said, it did happen on occasion. But of the times where it did happen, I think probably the single largest impact that comes to mind is actually the burning of what's now Newport Navy Yard. Back then it was Gosport Navy Yard in the American Civil War. Now, granted, this was something that the Union forces did themselves to stop the Confederates capturing the facilities, because if there's one thing that's worse than having your major navy yard burnt to the ground and all its timber and other supplies going up with it, it's the enemy getting their hands on it all intact. So obviously the US did have other ports. Even when it's the Union, you've got New York, Boston, Baltimore, etc., Philadelphia, which can all build ships instead, and they would have their own timber stocks. But as it was at the time, Gosport Navy Yard both contained a fairly large number of ships which would have been useful for the Union forces, but also, being a navy yard, contained a fair bit of pre-stocked timber and supplies for navy ships, both for refitting and occasional for construction purposes. And this did have something of a knock-on effect, because when you look at the way the rest of the war went, the Union Navy, in its bid to expand, whilst it did build a fair number of warships, the majority of its expansion came from requisitioning pre-existing ships from civilian service, which, okay, that's not necessarily a reflection on timber stocks, that's just quick and easy. But also when you look at the types of ships that the Union did build or have commissioned to be built, an awful lot of them either used relatively small amounts of timber, or they used short cuts of timber, which were much easier both to acquire in season form or to season, as compared to the mass timbers that you needed to build really big ships. Not necessarily, well, sometimes wooden ships, or potentially armoured ships with wooden hulls or wooden backing. And so instead you get things like monitors being more common, and even though she was laid down very much at the start of the ironclad race in the American Civil War, USS New Ironsides remained pretty much a one-off. Not entirely, but in part because of the dip in supplies of seasoned ship timbers and seasoned ship parts, which had all gone up in flames at Gosport Navy Yard. Now, as I said, of course, they didn't stop them doing it entirely because you had those other ports, but I think if the Gosport Navy Yard had not fallen to the Confederates early on, well, for one thing, obviously they wouldn't have been able to salvage the burnt-out hull of Merrimack and turn it into CSS Virginia, but that aside, even if, let's say, for arbitrary reasons, they came across the burnt-out remnants of a Union frigate somewhere and turned it into Virginia anyway, the simple fact is that with access to all those naval stores, including timber, the Union probably could have put together, or more heavily armed, a considerably greater number of ships than they did historically. Grummancat asks, who do you think transformed his navy more, Nelson or Ernie King? That's actually a really good question, because on the one hand, Nelson was not in as high a position of authority as King at the end of his career, and as it turned out, the end of his life. So therefore, he was not in a position to drive a kind of widespread institutional change across the entire Royal Navy. King, obviously, as the top dog in the US Navy, was in a position to do so, but he was also in a position to do so at a time when his main job was not to drive a complete institutional change in the way the US Navy worked. It was to gear up the US Navy for a major global conflict. And also, when you're talking about mid-20th century Navy, everything is significantly more complex than it would be in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And it was pretty complicated back then. And then, of course, you have the issue of lasting change, because whatever King might have done to transform the US Navy, the coming of the jet age and then nuclear, everything in terms of both nuclear weapons and power, obviously would see the US Navy change radically once again in the immediate post-war environment. So I would say the answer probably depends on how far down the line you're looking. If you're looking in the relatively short term, i.e. in their tenure at whatever their highest rank was, who affected the most change, then I would say the answer is almost certainly going to be Admiral King, because if you look at the state of the US Navy, not just numbers-wise, but also tactics, policies, procedures, etc.-wise, when he took over, or when he was appointed in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, compared to the US Navy that he left at just after the end of World War II, that is a huge amount of change for the Navy to have undergone in the space of less than 5 years. Conversely, if you look at the long-term impact measured over the span of decades, then despite never reaching the absolute upper echelons of power, I would say over 20, 30, 50, 100 years, Nelson probably had a greater transformative effect on the Royal Navy over that period of time than probably King has over the similar period of time from the late 1940s to today. Duke Master asks, it is an accepted fact that German ship designers were a little bit behind the curve in terms of designing efficient ships post-World War I. We tend to imagine sudden leaps of logic at times based upon historical hindsight that we possess, which of course they couldn't. How would they have gained such experience and knowledge in reality? An awful lot of it, even in the early 20th century, came down to practical experience. Now, for those of you who have been in similar industries, or really, I suspect, a lot of different industries, your experience will probably be similar to mine. When I left university as a graduate engineer, I thought I knew all sorts of fancy things. And inevitably, in your first role or two, this leads to clashes with colleagues who are just like, no, we're not doing it that way. And you're like, but this is how it's supposed to be done. And it's only over time that you end up realizing that, yes, there is the theoretical framework you might have been taught at university, but how things actually work on the ground in real life can often be very different. Sometimes things are more complicated than what you were taught, and sometimes things are actually much less complicated than what you were taught. And it's the same thing for ship designers. You get experience, admittedly to a certain degree, by education in a university or whatever, but when it comes to actually designing a ship efficiently, nothing beats actually doing that job. And that, in a normal Navy, would involve initially helping out more experienced designers work on things, and that way you wouldn't be in charge of necessarily making the layout particularly efficient. You'd just be in charge of implementing the things that your seniors told you to do, and then you would pick up from them. Okay, well, why are we doing it this way? Why don't we do it this way? And so on. And then a design would be finished, and then a new design would be called for, and perhaps that design might call for a slightly different spec or just a bigger, better ship or with more advanced technology. And then you might find, this was done this way with this particular vessel, but it was done that way perhaps not necessarily because it was the best way of doing it, but because that was the best way of doing it within the constraints of that particular design parameter. Now we have a little bit more freedom in as a given respect. Now we can design things in a better way. And gradually, as you build up experience, you would move on to designing smaller vessels and then larger vessels in cooperation with other designers. And then eventually you get to a point where you had enough experience to design your own ships of whatever size as the lead designer. And at the same time, out at sea, you can have things that on paper look absolutely perfect, makes all the sense in the world, but at sea it might either work really, really well, far beyond your wildest dreams, or it might work terribly. And so you'd have feedback and you think, well, okay, well, on paper this should have worked, but they said this really, really doesn't, so we won't do that anymore. But this worked much better than we thought, so we can implement that on a grander scale. And so you get the feedback of ongoing design work being practically implemented at sea. And I mean, obviously there are going to be the flashes of inspiration, the new technologies coming in from other sources and so forth, but that's your kind of core grind to build up your knowledge and experience. And this is what really shot German ship designers in the kneecaps, because the senior ship designers, the ones that had essentially built the Imperial German Navy from a glorified coastal defense force to the second largest navy on Earth, by the early 1920s, most of them were just being let go because the shipyards were being shut down, the design yards were being shut down, and even the ones that were there weren't allowed to design 35,000-ton capital ships and so forth. And so as they were either pensioned off, retired off, etc., that institutional body of knowledge, for the most part, disappeared. And that meant the new up-and-coming people, they might have had lots of academic knowledge about what was good, bad, or not, but they had no checks from people who had actually done it in real life at that point, or very minimal checks, one or two who might have hung around. And then also because obviously Germany's not building that many ships, not putting that many ships out into the field, and they're certainly not fielding until the Scharnhorst anything particularly large, then there's no practical feedback on what does and doesn't work either. So you get things like the Scharnhorst being wet and bow heavy, or, you know, the fact that Bismarck is really on a par with most treaty battleships, even though she's 7,000 tons heavier, and so on and so forth, simply because that body of institutional knowledge that would check and refine the younger designers, for the most part, had gone. And that's why, for instance, where you have designs where there is a bit more of a design lineage, so, for example, U-boats having, you know, the German submarine manufacturers having smuggled most of their expertise out to other places like the Netherlands, they're a bit more ahead in those kinds of fields. And that's also why, as things went on, you tended to see a refinement in design and therefore a refinement in efficiency as they got more experience. So, you know, some of the early German destroyers, really pretty terrible, but German destroyer design, even if some of the later ones weren't implemented, tended to get a little bit better. German cruiser design, on the other hand, they only ever got to build one class of, well, kind of two-ish classes of light cruiser, but very similar, one class of heavy cruiser, so there was never much opportunity to iterate and implement beyond that, because the Deutschlands are very, very different to the Hippers. And that's why, for example, where you have things like the E-boats or the Schnellboote, you know, where you iterate through multiple classes and you get that opportunity for feedback, you start to see some really, really nice stuff emerging, you know, midway through their construction periods. But when they try and design something completely flat out new, like the F-boats, it usually turns out to be an unmitigated disaster because there's not even anything similar that they can draw on at that point. Matt Osborne asks, a consumption question. It's gunnery practice day on the Royal Sovereign in 1639. A full crew has sailed out into the North Sea to conduct battle drill. At the sound of the whistle, all guns will stop blazing away as fast as their trained sailors can make them fire. With all guns at maximum rate of fire, how quickly will Royal Sovereign use up 40 100-pound barrels of gunpowder? Well, in 1639, the ship that would become Royal Sovereign is Sovereign of the Seas, but that's a little bit academic. So, using the armament that she had pretty much at launch, we're talking about a lower gun deck that has 30 demi-cannon drakes of various descriptions, a middle gun deck that has 30 culverins of various descriptions, and an upper gun deck, forecastle, quarterdeck, etc., that contains in total 44 demi-culverins of various descriptions. Now, exact amounts of powder used in each shot vary depending on the source and even the time period, even within the ship's career. But the most reliable sources that I've been able to find tend to indicate that a demi-cannon would use about 12 to 18 pounds of powder, a culverin 10 to 12 pounds of powder, and a demi-culverin 5 to 8 pounds of powder. So averaging out the various sources I've got, I've come to the conclusion that for the purposes of this experiment, we're going to say that the demi-cannons are firing 18-pound charges, the culverins are firing 12-pound charges, and the demi-culverins are firing 6-pound charges. That means that with 30 demi-cannon, 30 culverins, and 44 demi-culverins, you're expending 1,164 pounds of powder every time every single gun on the ship fires, at least of those guns. Now, if you have 40 100-pound barrels of gunpowder, assuming each barrel holds 100 pounds of gunpowder, you have 4,000 pounds of gunpowder. So divide one through by the other, and you would expend, you would get 3 full salvos. It's not really broadsides because every single gun is firing all the way around, but every gun on the ship can fire 3 times, and then you have enough for about 40% of the guns to fire once more. So you could get 3 full salvos from the entire ship, and then maybe 1 broadside, because bear in mind there's a number of 4.5 chase guns. So assuming that the gunners are really on their game, and assuming that they're firing as fast as humanly possible, based on historic rates of fire, where about every 90 seconds to 2 minutes is considered a decent rate of fire, you would be talking about, if you were going really fast, 6 minutes, and a slightly slower but still reasonable pace, about 8 minutes. Now, that's based on more classic age of sail reload times. With early 1600s guns, that may be slightly longer, but to expend 4,000 pounds of gunpowder from a ship like Sovereign of the Seas, you could pull that off, I would think, in comfortably under 10 minutes, easily, if you have well-trained gun crews all across the board. Farender Ritter asks, can you elaborate on U-boat or other World War II submarine countermeasures? Didn't the Germans develop decoy torpedoes that were actually fairly effective at confusing escorts? So at least as far as detection by sonar went, the Germans had 3 primary methods, some of which were only applicable to certain types of submarine. There were radar countermeasures and other types of things, and of course, technically speaking, the acoustic homing torpedo was also a countermeasure, but in terms of not being detected or giving the enemy a false idea of where you were, the most basic form was the Pillenwerfer, which was basically just a small container filled with material that reacted in contact with water to generate a bunch of bubbles, and that could be ejected out of a small hole in the side of the sub. See if you can spot where it is here on U505. And obviously that creates a realm of bubbles which will reflect the sonar pulses and give a false contact. The problem with that is that an experienced ASDIC or sonar operator will go, hang on a minute, this contact ain't moving. This is unlikely to be a submarine. Let's go looking for contacts elsewhere. The upgrade, therefore, to that was a system called Sieglinder, I think. Now, that is not a mobile decoy in the sense of some mobile decoys that are around in latter days, like these days, which are pretty much, torpedo noisemakers that wander off doing their own thing. It could move, and yes, it was electrically powered, but it could only move at about 6 knots. It could vary its course and depth and so forth. But it was also a decoy unit which was attached to the side of a sub, which could then be launched off. So it's not a full 21-inch torpedo designed to pretend to be a submarine, but it is a self-propelled decoy system. And the last system that was in play, at least to any degree of widespread, was called Alberich. And that's kind of the forerunner to the anechoic tiling that modern submarines have. It's essentially a foamed synthetic rubber, using both the rubber and the trapped air to absorb incoming sound. and that was applied on some of the electroboats late in the war, which it worked okay to begin with, but it did degrade quite quickly as compared to obviously more modern systems. So those are the three main decoy systems used by U-boats in the Second World War. There was also a system that was supposed to drown out a sonar screen by just generating very large explosions or noises that sounded like very large explosions, but that doesn't seem to have worked particularly well because, well, it kind of signposts where you are, or at least where you were, which makes the whole running away thing a little bit more difficult, especially when you've got, in the latter part of the war, you've got multiple escorts with multiple bearings on this whole thing. Cody Phillips asks, can you describe the advantages and disadvantages of having a shell that is very heavy for its calibre, as well as a shell that is somewhat light for its calibre, assuming that they have the same quality of construction? So if you want to be incredibly broad, then a heavier shell is better at long range and a lighter shell is better at short range, and somewhere along the line the two cross over. And this is because, assuming everything else is the same, including the gun it's fired from and the charge that's being used, then kinetic energy half mv squared. Well, if mass increases, v squared must decrease, and vice versa. So a lighter than usual shell will emerge from the gun barrel going much faster, which means that to reach a given distance, certainly at short range, it's going to need a shallower angle, so it's going to strike closer to vertical and it's going to strike moving considerably quicker. And that means that at short to short medium ranges, a lighter shell will have much better armor piercing capability because it's going to hit faster and it's going to hit closer to perpendicular, whereas the heavier shell is going to hit at a greater angle, which is going to mean more apparent armor for it to penetrate, and it's going to hit at a slower speed. Now, as you go further and further away from the ship, because assuming again that the shells have the same diameter and roughly the same size, because the lighter shell is less dense, therefore it's going to lose energy to the surrounding environment, i.e. air resistance, etc., much quicker. So at longer ranges, the lighter shell will slow down, and as it slows down, it's going to then, you're going to have a light shell and a low speed, so its penetration will be worse, whereas the denser, heavier shell will maintain its inertia or its momentum out for longer. Therefore, at a certain point, it will start to have better armor penetration capabilities. Also, because it carries its energy better, the heavier shell, assuming everything else is the same, might, if you're firing at very high elevations, might actually go further because it's going to retaining energy, therefore retaining velocity somewhat better. And once you get out into the very long range bracket, then because the heavier shell is going to be dropping at a steeper angle, it's now going to have greater benefits when it comes to penetrating deck armor than the lighter shell, which, assuming it gets there at all, is going to arrive relatively slowly, but also at a relatively shallow angle. DM Phoenix asks, I was reading the wiki page on the carrier HMS Indomitable and something surprised me. To quote, on 3rd of February 1953, she was badly damaged by an internal fire and explosion due to arson sabotage. Sabotage was not uncommon in the 1950s Royal Navy. Major fleet units assigned to the Far East were often sabotaged by disgruntled crew embittered by poor living conditions. End quote. I have seldom heard of such a thing in a major naval service, let alone a Royal Navy carrier, and did a bit of digging around. A short article written by Mr. J.P.L. Thomas states the explosion was caused by a leakage of petrol that caught fire. There is no question of sabotage. The whole sabotage thing sounds so out of character for the Royal Navy. What do you think happened? Was it a petrol accident or something more sinister? Now, in periods of the Cold War, there were cases of sabotage in various Allied navies. The Royal Navy and the US Navy both had periods where sabotage was particularly high. For the Royal Navy, it was the mid to late 1950s. For the US Navy, it was the late 60s, early 70s, circa the Vietnam period. However, those sabotage incidents tended, specifically with the Vietnam era, tended to have a lot to do with the politics of whether or not various people thought they should be in Vietnam or whether they specifically wanted to be deployed to Vietnam. in the 50s, there was a degree of disgruntlement in some elements of the Royal Navy, because bear in mind, at that point, you still have national service, so it's not an all-volunteer force. There are people there who may not necessarily want to be there. Deployment to the Far East, however, that's a little more sketchy. Some ships really did not want to go to the Far East. That much is true. But those tended to be the older ships that really had very poor ventilation, and at which point you can understand why you wouldn't want to go to a tropical environment. Later ships, or ships that had been refitted that did have at least halfway decent ventilation systems, didn't tend to have too many problems. And once you were on a ship that wasn't going to boil you to death like a kipper in a tin, actually the Far East was a relatively popular posting, all things told, because it was, well, exotic, it was warm, and it was away from the immediate threat of nuclear annihilation of Europe. So, yeah, that set off a few red flags for me, because, you know, to be honest, if there was poor living conditions aboard my ship, and yeah, admittedly, some Royal Navy ships did not have the world's best living conditions in the 50s, I would rather enjoy those poor living conditions somewhere relatively warm and peaceful than, I don't know, the freezing North Atlantic or the North Sea, which is also going to be quite wet most of the time if the conditions are that bad. But also you've got the specific nature of this incident aboard Indomitable in February 53, which, as you can see here, this is a picture of the aftermath, does involve a petrol fire and explosion on the flight deck. This actually kills 2 people and wounds several dozen more. Now, when you look at the sabotage incidents in various navies in NATO in that period and thereafter, whether that be US Navy, Royal Navy, or whoever, generally speaking, the sabotage incidents tend to be around causing relatively small areas of damage that have a disproportionate effect on the ship's capability of moving. So if you don't want to be deployed somewhere, you do something that will ideally slow down or cripple the ship's ability to be deployed, but without much danger to yourself. So if you go to US Navy museum ships, they'll tell you one of the favoured things was to chuck something into the turbine gearing, because that will immobilise a ship pretty darn good. US Navy did not take a very enlightened view of that because of the expense of it all and the seriousness of it. You could get in a lot of trouble if you got caught doing that. And in the Royal Navy, it was similar, where there were acts of sabotage. It tended to be, what can I do where I will delay the ship putting out to sea, and also something where I can do whatever it is I need to do or want to do and get away. Spoiler alert, setting off a fuel explosion on a flight deck is not something you're going to walk away from. You know, you may not want to deploy to wherever it is you're going to deploy to, but blowing yourself up in an aviation gasoline fire is probably the single stupidest way of not deploying somewhere warm. And that was, you know, the second bit of suspicion where I thought, you know, that something about this particular account seems a little bit off. So I did a little bit of digging further. So this quote is taken from a book called, pull up the title here, The Standard of Power, The Royal Navy in the 20th Century by Dan van der Vat, published in 2001. And interestingly, it seems to be the only use of this particular source in the entire wiki article. Now, I thought, right, well, in that case, it's been around for a while. It should have had some professional reviews. Let's have a look. Yeah, whilst Van der Vat does have a few pretty acclaimed books to his name, this is not one of them. Eric Grove, the late lamented Eric Grove, one of the leviathans of naval history, let's just say his book review of it is not kind. I won't read the whole thing because we'll be here for about 20 minutes. But some edited highlights. He opens his review with, according to the publisher's press release, this is a thoroughly researched history of the Royal Navy in the 20th century, a serious study of the technological and social change through which the Royal Navy, like Britain itself, has transformed itself almost beyond recognition. Sadly, It is nothing of the kind. That's his opening sentence. And it doesn't get any better, but as we go down towards the end of the review, we get this. So he's talked about a few other issues under discussion. He says both of the above areas that he's been talking about previously in the review might be considered matters of interpretation rather than fact, but the main problem with this book is its factual inaccuracy. It is simply riddled with glaring and simple errors, and I'm going to stop at the time period the channel stops at. So, fees at Dartmouth and Osborne were not scrapped by Fisher. Operational aircraft were not able to land on HMS Furious's flight deck by 1917. HMS Argus was not the first purpose-built aircraft carrier. Trowbridge's armoured cruisers may have been obsolete, but were hardly superannuated. Defence had only been in commission for 5.5 years. The French battleship Bouvet was sunk in the Dardanelles by a mine, not by plunging fire. Corvettes did not have coal-fired boilers. The flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet in September 1939 was not Queen Elizabeth. It had been in dockyard hands since August 1937. Captain Langsdorff of the Graf Spee did not wrap himself in the old Imperial German ensign when he shot himself. Admirals Andrew Cunningham and John Cunningham were not brothers. Hood was not sunk by flash penetrating her magazines. Barham sank in her on her port side. Type 21 and 23 U-boats were not Walter submarines. Trenchant sank the Ashigara, not the Ashigawa. Theseus was not a Hermes-class carrier. Ark Royal was not at Suez. Britain's first nuclear test did not involve HMS Plymouth, and the carriers Albion, Bulwark, Centaur, Hermes and Ark Royal were not on the stocks in 1953. All of these had been launched. It goes on like this all the way up to the present day. Anyway, he concludes with, this text is simply not trustworthy and readers need to be warned against a work that cannot be recommended even as background reading. This is a pity, but the reviewer would be failing in his duty by not spelling this out as clearly as possible. So, with all that in mind, and given that I did a fair bit of looking around other books that reference the incident, and none of them seem to think this particular incident was sabotage, I'm going to come down on the side of this incident almost certainly was not sabotage, and incidentally, having read possibly one of the most scathing book reviews I've ever seen Eric Grove write, I probably wouldn't be holding my breath on using that particular book as a source anytime soon for much of anything. Michael Gilson asks, for nations trying to beat treaty limits by building non-warships with the intention of converting them to warships, would an icebreaker have been a good starting point? Icebreakers already have a reinforced design and quite powerful engines. Admittedly, the hull form isn't good for speed, and the engines are optimized for low-speed torque, so they aren't going to become cruisers, but maybe some sort of monitor cruiser or coast defense ship? For the Imperial Japanese Navy, I wonder if peacetime use in finding and exploiting the resources of Hokkaido would help them more than a handful of warships. Same thing with the Kriegsmarine and increasing Baltic trade. Well, I think you pretty much nailed it on the head. An icebreaker's hull form and power plant is not designed for high speed in any way, shape or form. However, as you said, they are built fairly strongly. They have an awful lot of power in their engines, and icebreakers do tend to be of a relatively decent size. So if you do happen to be in the northernmost climes of the planet where such vessels could be justified as necessary, then yes, in theory, I think an icebreaker might make for a decent non-warship that you could later convert into a warship. The larger icebreakers of the time, between 2,000 and 6,000 tons, so you're not pulling a Sferia off with them, but smaller coast defense ships fall into that tonnage range. So I think, you've already got to have strength and decks and so forth. So if you did have a icebreaker and you kept the fore and aft decks clear for the installation of heavy guns afterwards, and perhaps even put a degree of quote unquote armor on the ship, as in saying, we're going to put a couple of inches of steel plating down the sides and bow of the ship to help protect it against incoming ice flows, and grant it a decent amount of buoyancy, then you could potentially have something that could be turned into quite a nice, neat little coast defense ship, at least for defense against anything up to maybe a light cruiser, with a relative degree of ease. Plus, of course, you'd have the advantage of it still being an icebreaker, so it can go places that a more conventional ship couldn't. John McCarthy asks, I recently read Build the Musashi by Akira Yoshimura. Musashi was built in a commercial shipyard in Nagasaki and was far larger than anything they'd built before. The books describe the modifications they had to make to the slipway, as well as adding massive curtains around it to hide it from prying eyes. The engineers were especially worried about launch. Would you describe how a slipway launch works? How do you go from a ship on blocks to one that will slide into the water? And what are the special challenges in launching a huge ship? Well, for a ship that's built on a slipway, very simply, obviously a ship's hull is not flat at the bottom, so it needs to be built up on blocks in the first place. So what you would do when you're building a ship on the slipway is there would be a cradle, which the ship would sit in, and the ship is built within that. And that means, of course, you are building a ship at an angle, so there'd be what's called a declivity board available, so you could check that as you went in and go, oh, okay, right, the ship is... because obviously you want to build the ship level, but if the ship's being built at an angle, you go, okay, well, let's say it's at a declivity of 5 degrees, arbitrarily. Usually it would be a bit more than that. So that would mean that if the instructions that you're building the ship to say, okay, well, these two bits need to be joined at 90 degrees and this bit is vertical, well, you need to make sure that the bit that's supposed to be vertical is actually offset, in this case, by 5 degrees, in order for it to be vertical once the ship is actually afloat. Now, this cradle, the props, all whatever you want to call it and however complicated you want it to be, and the hull itself will all be propped up. And part of that will obviously be to provide additional support as the ship is constructed, and part of that will also be to provide essentially braking force to stop the ship moving down the slipway when you don't want it to. Very occasionally, ships would start moving on their own if you didn't have enough braking support in place, which was a little bit worrying. And then once the ship's gotten up to a certain point and it's ready to be launched, then you have your ceremonial launching ceremony, which essentially amounts to somebody says something at the bow of the ship and someone at the other end knocks away a bunch of the props that are stopping it from sliding, or latterly mechanical devices may be used to do that. And then gravity takes its course because you now have, big heavy object on slope where the force of gravity will now hopefully overcome friction and ship starts moving down. The single biggest challenges of launching a very large ship are, one, when the stern of the ship is in the water and the rest of the ship is still on the slipway. That means, of course, now the bow and the stern are being supported by the slipway and the water, but the amidships area is not being supported, so this puts a huge strain on the ship, which is why it's important for the launch to be done relatively quickly so that the strain is transient and passing. A slow juddering launch can actually end up with the ship damaging itself under its own weight before it gets fully in the water. And the other problem, of course, is you don't want the hull to be going too fast at the end of it, so you usually hang a bunch of heavy chains off the bow to act as essentially friction brakes as it descends to stop it gathering too much speed, because if it does hit the water too fast, well, that in and of itself may cause damage to the ship, but also, even if it doesn't cause damage, you now potentially have several tens of thousands of tons of ship going across the harbour or the river at a velocity somewhat more commensurate with the ship underway than the ship being launched, and that might lead to collisions with other ships or the opposite bank or all sorts of other unfortunate things. And for a ship like Musashi, that's just going to make things even worse, because you're going to be worried, one, how fast is this thing going to be going when it gets off the slipway, and where is it going to end up once we kick it out into the water? And two, given the sheer weight of it, how much strain is this going to put on the hull, and will the hull survive the launch, and are we going to get it to launch quickly enough, but not too quickly, and so on and so forth. When I get round to doing a video on USS New Jersey's dry docking, there's actually a very funny story to tell about her launch, which was literally, a couple of hundred yards further up in the dock in that particular Navy yard many, many years ago. The Freaka 86 asks, I realise the value of the Kiel Canal isn't quite the same as the Panama Canal, but your video on fleet problems made me wonder, did the Allies ever consider attacking the Kiel Canal to make the transition between the North and Baltic Seas and vice versa a little more time and resource consuming and a little bit more dangerous due to possible enemy action? If so, what was the plan? And if not, why wasn't there a plan? Well, the answer is the Allies did consider attacking the Kiel Canal. There were obvious hazards, given that it would be very heavily defended by German anti-aircraft guns and fighters. But, of course, you have the port of Kiel, which was in and of itself a fairly major target. And unlike the Panama Canal, where there are multiple systems of locks to go through, at the Kiel Canal, there's just two sets of locks, one at each end. So the Allies, pretty much the same way as people attacking the Panama Canal, would decided, well, we're going to attack the locks, because if we can break the locks, then ships can't use them, which means ships would have to go all the way around. And so once the Allies were confident that they had enough bombers, both to make and escorts, to fight their way through to actually saturation bomb the locks, and of course enough bombers to spare from other roles to do so, because as you said, it's not quite as important as the Panama Canal, they did in fact actually do so. And there's a whole set of memoranda, for example, from 1944, from the summer, when the 8th Air Force bombed the locks at one end of the Kiel Canal very heavily and appeared to have managed to successfully block it for a given period of time. So that was essentially the plan, just drop enough bombs in the vicinity of the locks that the locks themselves either will be damaged, or the lock gate mechanisms will be damaged, or in some way, shape or form the locks will be jammed, and then that obviously forces enemy shipping to use the route all the way around Denmark. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, in Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, there's the SS Kiel, which has been aground since 1967. Her service history goes back to 1913 with the Newfoundland Railway, and she was used as a troop ship in World War II. Every few years, some bright spark gets the idea to turn her into a museum and tow her to a more suitable position, but the sheer cost of doing so ends these plans rather quickly. You can find various pictures and information about the Kiel online, and she holds an important part of Newfoundland history. So my question at this point is she worth saving based on her condition, and if so, exactly how would you get her into museum quality? Well, based on the latest photos I could find, unfortunately, I really don't think there's much that can be done to save her at this stage, because, someone very helpfully sent a drone out and done some drone photos of her as of last year, and the upper superstructure has pretty much collapsed. There's a few bits of the wall still there, but the ceiling's gone, and some of the side is very definitely bent. A good chunk of the deck has rotted away completely, so the steel plating is exposed and rusting, and much of her aft is covered in grass, which tells you just how much organic residue has built up over there. And the rest of the hull is obviously quite visibly deteriorated as well. Now, on the other hand, she does appear, broadly speaking, quite happy aground, so structurally she seems to be intact, but exactly how much of that plating is watertight or indeed actually still steel plating and not just rust held together with paint is another matter entirely. It's possible, I would think, that if the money could be raised to lift her off the rocks, and that would be the whole thing about how to get her off those rocks without further damaging the hull, then she might be floated somewhere that she could be preserved. But from the looks of the upperwork, she's in such a state you'd essentially have to strip down and rebuild or reconstitute pretty much everything above the main deck, which is going to cost a huge amount of money. Now, based on the fact she hasn't just keeled over and collapsed where she is, and she does spend a fair bit of time pretty much almost entirely out of the water, there does seem to be some strength left to her frame. So in theory, with an almost open checkbook, she could be salvaged. But I think practically, with what money theoretically could be raised, I don't think she's in an economical to repair condition, unfortunately. Certainly not in terms of hauling her off the rocks and taking her somewhere else to be rebuilt and then used as a museum ship. Camino John asks, an electrical question. On warships, how do they balance the load and the generator's output to be in equilibrium? In addition, what sort of protocols or systems were in place to avoid wide swings in electrical consumption? What sort of automation or engineering was involved to make sure that critical systems would continue to be powered while less important items are cut off due to battle damage? A quick read on portable generators mentions there is a momentary drop in voltage when additional load is added, and to rebalance, the generator automatically adjusts the magnetic field strength, thus creating more power and voltage. Now, of course, bearing in mind I'm not an electrical engineer, so the very fine details of some of this are a little beyond me, but I did study a reasonable amount of electrical engineering as part of my general engineering qualifications. But when it comes down to making sure the kinds of things you mentioned don't happen, you have areas like this. This is one of the distribution and control nodes for electrical generation aboard USS Massachusetts. So there are multiple generators, and several of these, which incidentally is another one of those slightly hilarious things when somebody asked at one point, what voltage is present on battleships? And I mentioned in passing that some stuff was 450 volts, and I think it was that way around, and someone started screaming in the comments that all US Navy ships are 440 volts. It's like, go into this area and have the entire thing just disproven, because there are just as many warning and safety levels for 440 volt as there are for 450 volt systems in the same room on the Massachusetts, and they're all period. So the answer is, what voltage do they operate on? Yeah, somewhere between 440 and 450. Anyway, that aside, there's a whole series of systems that are designed to regulate and control the output voltage. So there's a voltage regulator element. In this case, this board controls the AC generator number 2, or a part of the board does. So there's a voltage regulator element for different loads. There's also a selector switch, so you can alter the voltage there. There's various governors for frequency, amperage, and voltage, all of which can be changed manually as well as set to automatic. For example, down at the bottom center there's the voltage adjusting rheostat for AC generator number 2. And here's the part of the board for AC generator number 1. So you can see all the various systems there. So it's a mixture of manual and, to a certain degree, automatic systems as well. Plus, you've got to bear in mind that this thing is pumping out so much power. Just this particular generator, as you can see in the middle there, is producing just over 1600 amps at 450 volts, that individual systems coming on and offline, not really going to make the hugest difference unless you're talking about activating all 3 turrets from dead stop or something like that. And those are on their own separated circuits. For example, the ammeter for the 16-inch turret number 1 is on its own board, which is rated at 450 volts AC and 3210 amps. And all the major systems have either their own boards or their own switches. So if there's battle damage and perhaps one or more generators go down, then you can, well, there's a certain degree of automatic functioning, but a lot of it would be manual functioning, just turning off the systems that you don't need if the total power being generated and able to be transmitted to the rest of the ship somehow drops below what you need for the minimum amount needed for battle, i.e. things like your rangefinders, fire control computers, and gun turrets and so forth. Red Ranger asks, the other day I was playing a game of U-boat when I bit off a bit more than I could chew in the port of Gibraltar, and I had to put my vessel on the floor to conduct repairs when 2 notable things happened. First, by sheer coincidence, I landed next to a cargo ship I'd sunk earlier on in the fight, and second, whoever was working the depth charges suddenly developed the aim of a drunken monkey. Would proximity to the seabed and or a sunken wreck confuse ASDIC that much? The seabed probably not so much. The wreck definitely could. There are multiple accounts in the Second World War of wrecks being accidentally attacked. So they've picked up a sonar contact and gone, aha, this must be a submarine, we shall depth charge it and hedgehog it, etc. And then sooner or later, either somebody realizes that we've dropped a ton of ordnance and it's definitely hit in or directly near the proximity of our contact and nothing's happening, or somebody's going, hang on a minute, this contact hasn't moved for ages and is suspiciously close to the seabed. In fact, I don't think it's moved at all. And then they realise it's a wreck, and they've gone off to attack something else. Now, that's cases where they've mistaken a wreck's contact for a submarine and attacked it, but there are also obviously plenty of cases where they've gone, well, there's a sonar contact coming up. Oh, right, it's on the seabed and it's not moving. Check for a while. Nope, still not moving. Okay, that's probably a wreck. Let's go on and find something else. So in the particular case you're describing, it's not so much that it would confuse ASDIC, it's more that if the ASDIC contact is detecting a large stationary mass sitting on the seabed in the proximity or in the position where they reckon a ship has sunk previously, they're probably going to conclude it's a wreck and therefore go off and find something else to blow up. Architect096 asks, let's say that after the Second World War, a group of people managed to gather up enough cash to buy HMS Warspite. Would it be possible to keep her as a museum ship, or would she require too much repair work to make it possible? Would making a deal with the Royal Navy that they can get her back into service if necessary in exchange for help keeping her afloat be possible? And would it mean at some point in the 20th century we would see Warspite and New Jersey steaming together? Also, if she was around today, how hard would it be to get you and Dr. Clark off of her? I think it would depend a great deal on timing, because when she was scheduled for scrapping, various parts were removed from Warspite, including, as rather obviously here when she's aground at Prussia Cove, her guns. So you'd have to get in quite quickly after the Second World War while she is still armed, because then finding guns and reinstalling them would be an absolute pain. Now, with that said, although she was worn out, and although she was quite damaged, I mean, she'd been mined, she'd been bombed, she'd been hit by a Fritz X, so one of her aft turrets wasn't working, and there was a big concrete patch in there. At the same time, this is her aground quite some time after she actually hit and went aground, and she stayed there for a while. She was broken up in place. She pretty definitively was structurally in pretty good nick. It took breakers to get rid of her rather than the sea. So whilst the outer hull obviously had taken a fair bit of a battering over time, I think the majority of that would probably be fine, at least for a fairly long term as a museum ship, because ultimately most of it had been patched up to a level that the Navy was happy to take her back into service after that damage. The single biggest thing would be fixing the Fritz X damage. That would be quite expensive, but not impossible, I think. I don't think the Royal Navy, though, would want her back in service. So, unfortunately, the idea of Warspite steaming alongside New Jersey or some other similar thing, almost certainly not going to happen. I mean, she was a very worn ship. Her engines were worn. Lots of her systems were worn. But there is a difference between systems being worn to the point that she's not really got much service life left in her, and systems being museum worthy, because the fact that the turbines are a little bit worn and the boiler bricks are a bit worn doesn't make the blindest bit of difference if she's a static museum ship. I think if there had been a consortium that had actually bought her and said, no, we are going to run her as a museum ship, given that you have Malaya, Valiant, and Queen Elizabeth also due for scrapping, her sister ships. Now, granted, they are all slightly different to Warspite, but there'll still be a lot of interchangeable parts. I think the Royal Navy probably would have been quite happy to say, hey, look, if you're going to keep Warspite as a museum ship, if you really are going to repair her, well, here's the other 3 survivors, have a run over that and strip as many spare parts, etc. as you like, because, hey, those ships are going to the scrapyard anyway. At which point, back up spare parts to keep the ship running more generally, and possibly even entire hull plating sections to replace the concrete plugs could have been available. Now, you would have had to find space. You would have had to put her in Drydock at some point to do the major repairs. But again, if this consortium has raised enough cash, it's within the realm of reasonable possibility to pay for a short dry docking to undertake those kinds of refits and repairs before putting her to service as a museum ship. Perhaps the more interesting thing is, where is she going to go? She's unfortunately a little bit too long to fit where Warrior now is in Portsmouth. And you've got to bear in mind that, whichever group or person is responsible for saving her, they've saved her in the mid to late 1940s. So Chatham is still very much an active Royal Navy base at that point. Portsmouth is, Plymouth-Devonport is, etc., etc. So a lot of the places where you might look at museum ships in the UK these days and go, aha, we can put her there. In those days, they still would have been very active ports. So at that point, I think pretty much the only place that could both fit her and at that stage probably wasn't active enough that you couldn't justify putting her in as a tourist attraction anyway, is probably actually where Belfast is now. Because although HMS Belfast is a little bit shorter than Warspite, she's not that much shorter, and granted Warspite is a bit beamier, but that can be accommodated in the Thames relatively easily. So, yeah, in theory, she would be based in London, and, well, given London's status as a tourist attraction, she might actually have raised enough money over time to still remain there to this day. Andre de Coult asks, words and expressions can have multiple meanings and even multiple pronunciations for the same spelling. Some are related and some are not. Could you please talk about the relationships, if any, between some words and expressions and their otherwise non-nautical meanings, like bow and stem, poop and stern, able, as in able seaman, come about or go about, heave to, wear ship, roads, as in Hampton Roads, sound, as in Puget Sound, etc. Well, in some cases, words can actually have multiple meanings even within a nautical context, even though they have no actual direct relationship to each other. So, for example, the sound in Puget Sound. Sound or sounding means to test the depth of something nautically when you're aboard a ship. So you can sound a tank, or you would sound a harbour to see how deep the harbour is. In a tank, you'd sound a tank to see how deep the water in the tank is. But sound, as in the harbour area, like Puget Sound, has no relation to figuring out the depth of it, even though it might sound like it should be. You might think, oh, so maybe a sound means some kind of small harbour where you can sound out the depth and determine that it is deep enough. In fact, it seems to derive, the sound as in the harbour, derives from the Anglo-Saxon sunt, from which in English we get asunder. So perhaps it's sund, I don't know. I'm not a linguist. And that derivation, basically meaning to part or to put apart, seems to relate to sounds as in the harbours, because sounds are typically, compared to other forms of harbour, relatively narrow, and they're kind of gaps between bits of land, and therefore, so somewhere like Puget Sound is technically saying, well, this is Puget, it is a harbour, but it is a harbour that has a fairly narrow access and in broad terms is relatively small as compared to a big estuary harbour or something like that. Roads, as in the Hampton Roads, etymologically derives from road, as in an Old English term that means to ride, and ships ride at anchor, and stead, which is a place where someone may do something. So a roadstead was somewhere where someone may ride, specifically in a nautical definition, somewhere where a ship may ride at anchor, i.e. a calm section of water, not necessarily a harbour. It could be a partially sheltered harbour. And from roadstead derived road, so Hampton Roads is technically Hampton Roadstead, i.e. this is an area off of Hampton where a ship can, or multiple ships can, ride at anchor here with a degree of safety. Of course, on land, roads, as in a place where one can ride, pathways, etc., and then later derives from that. Able seaman is, as opposed to ordinary seaman, is essentially derived from capable seaman. So an ordinary seaman would be someone who knows a few things but needs a bit of instruction. Can be left alone to deal with the basic matters, but needs to work as part of a team under supervision for the more complicated stuff. Whereas once you've got experience and you've satisfied your commanding officers that you know what you're doing, you're then seen as capable and therefore can be trusted and can be paid more. And a capable seaman, an able seaman, thus becomes, well, as the job title entails. This is not able-bodied seaman, because you could be an able seaman even if you're missing a leg or an arm or an eye, and equally you could be an ordinary seaman even if you had all four functioning limbs. It was more to do with your skill and experience than anything else. Cringe Pog asks, Yamato and her sisters appear to have three possible distinct fighting positions. Obviously, the lower one is the conning tower, but what of the middle and upper bridges? Is it known what each of these is for? Yep, so as you can see here, we've got the conning tower, bottom right. This is a cross-section through Yamato's superstructure. And then you've got 2 decks above. You've got this second position, which you are referring to just below some rangefinders. And then at the top of the major part of the superstructure, there's another enclosed position just below the main rangefinder up top there. So the upper one, which is often referred to as first bridge, this is the combat bridge. So when the ship is unsurprisingly in combat, this is where the ship's captain and the majority of his command staff would work from. The Japanese, much like the Royal Navy, weren't particularly fond of operating from their conning towers, even though Yamato did have one. The second bridge, the sort of middle one that's halfway between the top and the conning tower, known as second bridge, this is the compass bridge, would possibly be known as compass platform in other areas, so navigation, etc. Could also be used by admirals if admirals were aboard the ship. So yeah, essentially they are both fully operational bridges for the use of the ship's crew, but in most day-to-day functions you tend to find that it's usually going to be operated from the uppermost of those two. Andrew Dederer asks, what was the naval reaction to the 4 stackers? We know the US Navy was deficient in light units during the run-up to World War I, then it came out of it with 200 plus units in a few similar classes all built in a handful of years. Was this the first real instance of mass production of military vessels? In terms of mass production, no, not really. There's a fair number of examples of mass production of warships going back through history, depending on exactly how you want to define it, but if you want to go by perhaps the more modern definition, then something like the Crimean War gunboats would be an early example of mass-scale production of steam-powered warships, albeit obviously they're individually slightly smaller than the Wicks and Clemson class destroyers. And whilst the sheer scale of the Wicks and Clemsons as a unified-ish class was quite impressive, the idea of churning out dozens and dozens and dozens of destroyers to the same spec wasn't, again, particularly new. The Royal Navy had been churning out destroyers in groups of 60 to 80 or so quite regularly during the First World War. I mean, you look back at, the V&W class and the S class, the R class, etc. And during the war, as I say, the Royal Navy's building about as many, if not more, destroyers as the US, but the S class, the R class, the V&W class, and the derivatives within that are somewhat more distinct from each other compared to the Wickses and Clemsons. Now, where the Wicks and Clemsons do cause everyone to take a little bit of a step back and go, oh, okay, hang on a minute, is because they are some of the largest and most powerful destroyers at the time of their construction. Having 4 4-inch guns, okay, V and W class do have that, and they're roughly contemporary. But firstly, the Wicks start construction about a year before the V&Ws, and contemporary destroyers at that point, if they have 4-inch guns at all, tend to have maybe 3 of them, not 4. And the Wicks and Clemsons remain unrivaled for sheer numbers of torpedoes, because even the V&Ws will have maybe a pair of triple launchers. The Wicks and Clemsons, you're talking about double that easily. So what's remarkable about them is that the USA has suddenly showed up with a massive fleet of destroyers of the latest design types, extremely heavily armed. So whereas the Royal Navy might be able to point out and go, yeah, well, we built roughly the same number of destroyers in a roughly similar time period, the fact is, because the Royal Navy is iterating up and up and up, about 2/3 of the destroyers it's built are smaller and significantly less heavily armed compared to the Wicks and Clemsons. And that's the thing that really gets it for the US Navy, is the fact that not so much the numbers, or not even to a certain extent the commonality, but the fact it's commonality and numbers and quality all in one. Paul from Chicago asks, what is hanging in the rigging of this model of a Kiel? Hammocks? Would that it were. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I believe it's laundry day on this mini Kiel, because that is a set of shirts and trousers. Yep, that is how you do laundry on an Age of Sail ship of the line. Once everything's been washed and scrubbed, string it between the masts, and you get natural air-dried clothing. HMS Vanguard 46 asks, what do you think a modernisation of HMS Vanguard would look like if she was kept in reserve? I know it's slightly out of the channel scope being possibly 1960s, but I wanted to ask. If it's the early 1960s, it's probably going to be relatively minimal. I don't think anyone's going to be dumb enough to try and stick Sea Slug on Vanguard. But Sea Cat was designed to replace Bofors mounts, and she does have a bunch of sextuple Bofors mounts, so potentially update her radar systems and replace some of the 40mm Bofors with Sea Cats. Depending on how her displacement is doing at that point, I could potentially also maybe see an argument for removing the super firing 5.25-inch gun mounts. That would save a bunch of weight, and probably someone would stick a Sea Cat or something on them as well. That would leave you with 4 twin 5.25s, the lower deck mounts, a bunch of short-range surface-to-air missiles, and an updated radar suite. Probably also put a positive pressure ventilation system, kind of like what they did for Belfast. And there you have a kind of early 1960s NATO surface action group - Sverdlov killer leading vessel. You've saved a little bit of weight overall. You've still got the big guns to kill cruisers. You've got some 5.25-inch for, well, AA work, anti-surface work, I guess. And you now have some missiles as well. The other thing you might potentially do in the early 60s maybe would be, if you didn't want to put Sea Cats where the 5.25s are, but you still wanted to save weight, would be maybe to replace the 5.25 twins with 3-inch automatic twins, like they had on HMS Tiger. That would provide significantly improved short-range anti-aircraft gun-based defence and save an awful lot of weight considering the weight of the guns and turrets for the 5.25s. But I think that's really about as far as you'd go with an early 1960s refit of Vanguard. Zed Stewart asks, why is water over a ship's bow green? Well, you've got to bear in mind that a lot of shipping originally would have had a lot of sailing done in coastal waters rather than deep oceanic waters. And in coastal waters, a lot of water is actually green. The blue is more of a reflection of the sky above than anything else, because you've got suspended algae and stuff like that. And even in the deep ocean, between seaweed and more algae, very often, if you actually look at it in and of itself, at least the top layer of seawater is actually green, with organic life, or at least it should be. Now, in really deep oceans, in dead zones and really cold parts of the world, that's not necessarily the case, but it usually is for most areas where you'll find shipping. And when a ship pitches down, or a wave smashes into it, or both, and water crests and foams over the top of the ship, that's obviously going to be the uppermost portion of the sea, which then, now that it's got sunlight, if anything, shining through it rather than off of it, is going to display its truer colours, so it's going to look rather green. And then it comes smashing down on your ship and runs off over the side, and so everyone's like, well, that's green water over the bow, hence the origin of the term. Seb Dove asks, in the Royal Navy in the Second World War, where is the safest station on a ship in general? When I was a child, I used to imagine an open-air anti-aircraft battery would be safest, as you could escape a sinking ship quicker, or maybe on the bridge, as you know what's going on. However, as I've gotten older, being behind armour deep in the ship seems to be a safer bet. Is there any safest position on a ship, as many naval battles seem to include the line, and then the bridge was hit, killing the command crew? Well, different people have different opinions on that. Yeah, as some of you may know, one of my great-uncles decided that he was going to join the safest place in the Navy. He thought he would be a stoker on a ship. Specifically, he was going to aim for a battleship, because at the end of the day, if you're behind multiple layers of anti-torpedo defence system and 13 inches of solid armour, surely that's got to be one of the safest places on the ship. And yes, technically speaking, being a stoker in the boiler room of a battleship is probably the safest place you can be on a ship, right up until it isn't. And of course, he got assigned to the Royal Oak, so that turned out not to necessarily have been the best bet in the world. Poor old chap. Only one of his brothers to die in the war. But unless you are torpedoed, you were pretty safe there. If, however, you don't fancy the outside odds of drowning horribly in the darkness, I would say that probably the single safest position to be in, and certainly the one I would pick if I had to, would be, well, up, believe it or not, up top in the rangefinder and fire control spotting positions on the foremast. I personally would find that absolutely terrifying because, as you know, I have vertigo. But statistically speaking, it's pretty darn safe. If the ship is going to sink, that's pretty much the last place that's going to go underwater. And if the ship capsizes, it usefully puts you a fair distance away from the rest of the ship, so you are less likely to be sucked down with the rest of the ship. And if you think about it, the odds of being hit by a shell up there are ridiculously slim. You're high enough up that if a bomb or shell hits some other portion of the ship further down, the blast effect almost certainly isn't going to harm you, and you're probably even out of range of most shrapnel and splinters. And yeah, it's just the odds of getting hit or being injured by nearby hits are so low. Now, the problem, of course, is in rough weather, you're going to be going ping pong, rattle, 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 moving 400 or 500 feet with every major roll of the ship. But if you like roller coaster rides, that's not a bad thing. Or if you can get over a fear of heights, absolutely fantastic. So, yeah, I would nominate foremast or mainmast spotting positions as probably the single safest place you could go on a Royal Navy warship in the Second World War. Certainly any substantial sized vessel, because even strafing runs aren't really going to go for you. They're going to go for the hull. Ian Carr asks, as merchant shipping was sunk during the war and replaced in the Second World War, were slower or older ships redeployed to less dangerous parts of the world, and did the replacement shipping allow the speeds of Atlantic slow convoys to be increased and thus efficiency improved? Well, generally, most merchant ships were privately owned, so to a certain extent the owners could dictate where they went. Of course, if they were chartered for specific cargoes on specific routes, they would have to go with convoys and so forth, and governments may well say you need to carry this cargo. But outside of specifically engaging their services to go into a particular area that was away from the North Atlantic, there wasn't a huge amount that the government could do to say, right, specifically these older, slower vessels need to go elsewhere. And to be honest, any vessel that could carry stuff was good. Now, the prevalence of Liberty ships and Victory ships did allow in the latter part of the war for convoys that were made up pretty much entirely of Liberty or Victory ships or ships capable of that kind of speed to be formed. But you've got to bear in mind, one, there's a cruising speed as opposed to your top speed, and two, there's the fuel economy of your escorts to take into account as well as their ability to operate ASDIC or sonar, etc., etc. So whilst in general convoy speeds did tick up very slightly during the Second World War, particularly towards the end, it's not by a huge amount. I mean, the other thing that really doesn't help is that the number of ships sunk versus the number of ships that were around before the war is a very confusing mess to try and look at, because when you look at the more typical figures for numbers of merchant ships sunk, you'll see figures bandied around, for example, like 4,700 British flagged merchant vessels, so not including other allied countries, American, French, Norwegian, etc., etc. The problem is that's British flagged merchant vessels, period. That includes trawlers and fishing boats, which are smaller than trawlers, and all sorts of other very small coastal and ancillary craft. Whereas, again, depending on other figures, they estimate the global ocean-going merchant fleet was somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 ships total before the war. Now, Britain is traditionally credited as having a merchant fleet that amounted to about 2/3 of that, and so figures where you see 1,900, 2,000 odd ocean-going merchant ships would seem to tally with that. But then, of course, if 4,700 merchant ships were sunk, well, that's almost 2.5 times as many ships as they actually had, and wartime production was good, it wasn't that good. And that's how you know there's a huge amount of smaller non-oceanic vessels in that larger figure. But then when you try and figure out, well, how many ocean-going British flagged merchant vessels were sunk, then you get all sorts of answers, everything from 900 to 1200 to 1900, i.e. pretty much all of them, to 2400 or so, i.e. 500 more than Britain had at the start. And the fact that Britain actually had a merchant fleet at all towards the end of the war, at the end of the war, kind of dictates that those high figures probably are not necessarily quite so true. And that's just with the British fleet, let alone, you know, the American merchant fleet and so on and so forth. So essentially what I'm getting at is that there was still a large enough percentage of older ships around, because of course some wartime production was sunk as well, that unless you're looking at exceptional circumstances or a convoy that's very specifically been put together for specific reasons, there's usually going to be some older and potentially slower ships than just Victory and Liberty ships sitting around in most convoys even late in the war. TST 1987 asks, why and how is the room on a warship built to hold and punish naughty sailors and captured enemy combatants called a brig? The most I could discover myself is the word brig comes from brigantine, a fast two-masted square-rigged ship. Were brigantines used as prison ships, or were prison ships almost always brigs? So it appears the origins of the term brig for a prison aboard a ship do actually come from the brigantine, the two-masted small vessel, familiar to those of you who are like the age of sail. The term brig, as in referring to a ship's prison, seems to originate from some point in the 1830s to the 1840s, and from what I could determine, what seems to have happened is that with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, obviously the Navy was downsizing quite a bit anyway, but in addition, as ships grew larger, so, you know, first rates became 100, at least in the Royal Navy, went from 100 to 120, 130, 140 gun ships, and the third rate evolved into a 90 gunner with two gun decks. Frigates went from having, you know, 20, 30, maybe 40 guns to having 50, 60 guns and so forth. So everything was trending upwards in size. And then right down near the bottom, you had the two-masted brig. And this was a small, relatively cheap ship, but in the 1820s and 1830s, there was no way it was really a competitive vessel anymore. And so not only was the Royal Navy downsizing as a whole, but brigs especially were being sold off en masse relatively cheaply, usually fairly heavily worn. And that suddenly meant that with a glut on the market, well, if you need a ship to move prisoners from point A to point B, or a ship to just sit there and be a home temporarily for prisoners, you're probably going to end up using a brigantine or a brig. And even in the Royal Navy, when they've got some spare brigs lying around, they may be used for that kind of stuff. And so to be thrown in the brig would become, you know, shorthand for being thrown in prison. And then once those ships rotted out and more formal on-board prison facilities were established, the phrase seems to have just stuck and spread. Reichspeer Minister asks, if it's even possible to answer, how did the incorporation of material science influence the cost of shipbuilding regarding the design, raw materials, and labour and build time during the era of steam and steel until the Korean War? Well, unfortunately, it made everything dramatically more expensive because, well, things cost more to produce when they're more complex. You know, back when the extent of materials science for the steam and steel era, well, steam era at least, was iron. Well, you melt down iron from raw iron ore and some scrap iron. You can then cast it from liquid form and forge it, and, you know, hammers, rollers, presses, whatever you want. But essentially, that's all you need to do. Now, that's still a fairly complicated, technically advanced and expensive process, but then once you move on a couple of decades, and now you're talking about Bessemer furnaces, they need more fuel. So that's more expensive to run in the first place. You need to actually build the things. You still need to produce the iron in the first place to then turn into the steel. You've got add various small additives that you're putting in to turn it into steel. And then once you've got the steel, now you have to forge it and press it and hammer it and shape it. And because it's stronger, that means you need bigger and meaner tools to do that with. And then you get into things like Harvey steel and Krupp steel, where you have to put in all sorts of fancy additives, which themselves have to be extracted and purified. And now you have to do face hardening, so you've got to build a whole rig for that. And then you saw how complicated it was to build modern era guns, and so on and so forth. And it goes on. And that's just the structural armor and guns materials, let alone the increasing complexity of engines made possible by more advanced materials, and so on and so forth. So, although material science allowed you to build bigger ships and allowed you to build ships of a similar size, let's say in the First and Second World Wars, but with greater capabilities, or refit older ships to have more capabilities, it also meant that the cost of everything went up, because the number of steps you had to go through in order to make the materials that went into the baseline of your ship were, so much more complex and so much more extensive. King Brock asks, in the steam and steel era, why was the battle line the standard formation? It seems like having all your ships lined up would make fire control easier for the enemy, as once one ship finds the range, you can use simple trigonometry to extrapolate the range of all the other ships in line. In addition, if the range is good but the lead is off, there is the potential to hit a ship that you weren't actually aiming at. Was the simpler communication worth these downsides, and were there not actual concerns? How did radio change all of this? Well, once they got the whole ramming thing out of their heads, the simple fact was the battle line was still the easiest method of control, because, it's quite easy to just follow the leader. And also, it worked in terms of guns, because ships, especially by the era of steam and steel, are considerably longer than they are wide. And with all the machinery in the middle, it meant that the heaviest concentration of guns you could get was on the broadside, which meant it made sense for ships to fight broadside to broadside, because that's where they could bring the most firepower to bear. Once you're going to fight broadside to broadside, well, your guns in a fleet, generally speaking, are going to have roughly similar penetration characteristics. Now, you will end up with some circumstances where that's not entirely the case. At Jutland, there'll be 11-inch and 12-inch guns in the German fleet, so they're going to be much of a muchness within a few hundred yards, maybe a couple of thousand yards of each other for penetration. But in the British fleet, there'd be 12-inch 45 guns all the way up to 15-inch guns, with the intervening longer barrel 12-inch and 13.5-inch and so forth, and the occasional 14-inch, thanks to HMS Canada. And so you could argue at that point, well, the armour penetration of a 12-inch gun, maybe a 12-inch 45 or something, would necessitate those guns being closer to the enemy, and the 15-inch guns could be further away from the enemy and achieve the same level of penetration, which is technically true, except now the gun smoke and funnel smoke of the nearer ships are going to get in the way of your more distant ships with the heavier guns. And of course, if you're fighting at a distance where penetration may or may not happen, depending on the angle of the enemy ship, the distance exactly which enemy ship you're facing, does the ship have 12-inch armor, 13-inch armor, 14-inch armor, whatever, well, you don't really want to then put your biggest and best guns on the same kind of marginal performance level by shoving them further back. So having them closer in where they can, where your 12-inch guns will probably penetrate and your 15-inch guns definitely will penetrate, makes a lot of sense. You've also got to think about the defensive perimeter for your cruisers and destroyers. A single line means there's a fairly definitive defensive perimeter on all sides, whereas if you start staggering your ships, then that defensive perimeter has increased in complexity quite significantly, and your ability to, say, swap destroyer flotillas from one side to the other if one side comes under attack from enemy destroyers, or if you need to get your destroyers out of the way of the main gunfight, well, that distance becomes a lot greater, which in and of itself can become a problem. And of course, if you have ships staggered, then ships might get in the way of each other if they're trying to target specific enemy vessels. And the other thing is, of course, if you have anything other than a line heading in a particular direction, then if, for example, you had what would otherwise be a dead-ahead line, but you turned everybody at, say, 30 degrees, or you had everyone chevroned out or whatever, then range decreases and increases may adversely affect some portions of your line more than others, or you might find the range is decreasing when you don't want it to, or increasing when you don't want it to, depending on your alignment with the enemy. So if you want to maintain a fairly steady course, which is the best for regular gunnery, in addition to all those other issues mentioned earlier, it's just better to stay in a line. Even with radio, once you have any significant number of ships, line formation's still best. That's not to say that at very small scales where you've only got 2 or 3 ships, you can't do something different. You definitely can, because at that point, if you've got 2 or 3 ships, stepping them off or adopting a slightly different formation can have its advantages. But once you start getting 4, 5, 6 ships involved, having them all in a line simplifies things so much. Elliot W. James asks, can you recommend books specifically devoted to warship armour in the period of 1880 to 1905? Books are going to be somewhat harder because, for the most part, unfortunately, especially for someone with my engineering background, people haven't written all that much about naval armour specifically. There are treatises on naval armour from before that time period, when people found it new and interesting. And then once you get into the 1880s and onwards, it kind of stops being written about. I think mostly because that's when it starts to become quite secretive. And by the time you get to the other end of things in the late 20th century, where things are no longer quite so secret, the market just isn't there, so people don't tend to write about it all that much. So if you want to read about that kind of thing, I would actually recommend the Eugene Slover website and the NavWeps website. They both have quite extensive documentation and writing about it. On the Nav website, a lot of it's been done by Nathan Oken, and on the Eugene Slover website, there's a bunch of extracts from US Navy manuals, both of which obviously talk quite extensively about armour, and specifically armour in that period as well. So that would be a good place to start. And a lot of Nathan Oken's work was also published in Warship International, if you're worried about that kind of stuff. Beyond that, outside of going into doing things like archival research, if you want a book that goes into any significant degree of detail, then if you can find a copy, Forging the Fleet, Naval Armour and the Armour Makers 1860 to 1916 would be my primary suggestion. The thing is, almost every other book that references naval armour to any great degree is not specifically about naval armour. It'll either be about ship development in general or about the development of naval guns, and obviously that therefore has to reference armour, but it's not specifically an armour book. Mark Roman asks, certain ships, Washington, Iron Duke, Warspite, were known for excellent gunnery. Given that barrel life is in the low hundreds of shots, how did a crew achieve this? As a competitive long-range rifle shooter, I know that achieving excellence requires firing thousands of shots each year. Well, in some ways the warship crews had it easier, and in some ways they had it harder than someone like yourself who shoots small arms, because at the end of the day, you have the firearm, which obviously you have to tune and maintain, but if you like, fire control system for the thing that guides the barrel as to where it should go, keeps it on target, and decides when to pull the trigger, all of that is on a rifle is done by your brain and your body. So that's why you have to keep in practice. Whereas on a battleship, the fire control system is actually an electromechanical device, rangefinders, fire control computers, and settling and aiming devices for the guns themselves. Now, obviously, you do have to keep all of that in maintenance, but if the system works, then it will continue to work. An electromechanical system, as long as it's well maintained, doesn't lose something like muscle memory. But the flip side to that is that obviously a ship's fire control system is a massively complex piece of information, and instead of you instinctively taking in information like wind speed and temperature and so forth, the human crew of the ship has to feed that information to the fire control system. So for ships that got a really good reputation for gunnery, like you mentioned, and renown, for example, as well, what it comes down to is fine-tuning and learning the quirks of your particular fire control system. And that involves, obviously, battle practice. So initially, it'll be a case of, okay, well, here is the ship. We know where we are. We know what we're doing. Here is the target. We know exactly what it's doing because it's a test. Now we'll fire and we'll see how things change. So statistically, or should I say mathematically, we should hit. We didn't. We went 100 yards over, 50 yards long, 50 yards to the right. Okay, so we know that some part of this system is wrong. Now, is it our observations? Is it something to do with the mechanism? So you could check perhaps the rangefinders and say, okay, well, we took our values off an average value, or we took our values off of this rangefinder, and we went 100 yards over. But this other rangefinder actually shows what we now know to have been the correct range. So then you would test again, and perhaps using the data from that rangefinder that you've now reckon is accurate. And okay, so now if that's landed and that is accurate, so we know this rangefinder is actually on target. These other rangefinders are off. Now at that point, you can just go, okay, well, whatever these rangefinders say, drop by 100 yards, or you can try and say, okay, well, we know this one is accurate, and the others are off by 100 yards at, say, 20,000 yards. Well, let's drop by 10,000 yards. So we're halving the distance. Now, are the others now off by 50 yards, or are they still off by 100 yards? Because if they're off by 50 yards, then that suggests that at 0, everything will be okay, but there's some kind of divergent error. Whereas if it's just constantly off by 100 yards, it could just simply be that somebody's knocked a dial one click too far or something like that. And so you fine-tune and maintain and correct your systems. Test again. Okay, now we're getting closer to being accurate. And so on and so forth, because you've got to obviously check your inputs, you've got to check your outputs, so is the data being collected by your rangefinders or whatever accurate? Then is it being transmitted accurately to your fire control computer? Is your fire control computer doing the calculations correctly? And is it outputting that data to the guns correctly? And is that being transmitted correctly? And are your gun crews following that data correctly? Now, of course, the useful thing is that with a mechanical system like that, you can break down and isolate each stage of the system, make changes and adjustments, and move on to the next. And so eventually, once you've got everything in line, or at least you think you have, you can go back to doing more gunnery testing, and oh look, now you're pretty accurate. And by this point also, everybody who works on the guns and the fire control systems, etc., has a pretty good idea of how their systems work back to front. So if something does start to drift, they can spot it. And then it's just a case of keeping your hand in, making sure that your spotters are still giving you good information, your range estimators are giving you good range estimates, and so on and so forth. Basically, making sure the data going into the system is high quality. And that means that once everything's been nicely dialed in, then even if several years later the barrels need to be replaced, then, well, you just go, okay, well, before these settings all worked, now we'll fire the new guns a few times, see what the general pattern of difference is, and if there is any difference, well, then we know how to correct for that. So, if you like, essentially, compared to a small arms firing, it's almost like they are able to freeze all the different portions of your thinking and muscle memory when you're firing a rifle, and just put it to one side and then bring it straight back out again for the next time you fire a rifle, and in between you can actually do static tweaks to make you even better. Very crudely. I mean, there's a whole series of videos coming at some point about fire control systems and how they work and how their redundancy goes, etc., etc. And I've already done one on range finding, but that would be the loose version. Dave Collier asks, what was the GIN flag or GIN pendant RPC in the Royal Navy? When would it be used? Do you know what it looks like? And is it still a thing? So the gin pennant seems to have emerged at some point, depending on your sources, either in the latter part of the 19th century or in the late 30s and early 1940s. And because it's an unofficial flag, it can take many forms. Some sources say that it is a old starboard manoeuvring flag, which would be a white vertical stripe in the middle with green at either end. Others sources claim it's just a green triangular pennant, and sometimes still others will say, because again, the improvised nature of these flags, they'll have some kind of glass on them, like with this basic example. So what it looks like specifically, it could be anything. There is some photographic evidence of a gin pennant being flown in the Second World War, but of course, it being a black and white photo, all that shows is a vaguely triangular pennant, which is definitely white in the middle and darker at either end, although it's not entirely clear whether it's really dark at one end and lighter dark at the other end, which would indicate two different colors, or whether that's just a trick of the light and it is actually the green, white, green of a starboard signaling flag. But either way, they definitely exist in various forms. Whether or not it's still a thing and when it would be used, well, it would be used to essentially say, hey, look, guys, we're having a celebration, at least to the officers. Officers, come over, grab a free drink, which is always a welcome sight aboard most ships. If it's still a thing or not, I don't know. If anyone has either served in the Royal Navy or still is serving in the Royal Navy and knows of a ship that perhaps in the last 10, 20 years has hoisted a gin flag, let us know in the comments below. It would be very interesting to find if it's still an ongoing tradition. J Mace asks, did Jellicoe have any knowledge of the fact that Beatty was having flash protection systems disabled on his ships before the Battle of Jutland? I don't believe so. I mean, Jellicoe has enough on his plate dealing with the Grand Fleet without, micromanaging Beatty, who's in a completely different part of Scotland, and the way he runs his section of the fleet. But it is interesting when you look through the correspondence, which Simon Harley's actually quite neatly tabulated on the Dreadnought Project website under the article A Direct Train of Cordite. I mean, different people have interpreted that correspondence in different ways, but at least to me, it seems very interesting in that the opening letter from Beatty goes into exhaustive detail as to why British ships might blow up compared to German ships, and goes through almost every possible permutation and cause, everything from poor turret design to unstable propellant and so forth, but does not in any way, shape or form mention ammunition handling. And the first three replies from three completely separate admirals in completely or naval officers in completely separate positions, all are variations on, yeah, that may or may not be valid in some respects, but what about the fact that you lot were, dragging ammunition up, leaving cases uncovered, but essentially not following the ammunition handling regulations, or words to that effect. And then at some point, Beatty gets very defensive over it all. And when Jellicoe enters the fray, Jellicoe says that as far as he was aware, the correct drill for handling cordite was being followed. So to me, that would seem, to me at least, obviously this is my interpretation of things, and as I say, other historians have come to different conclusions, but my interpretation of that seems to be that Jellicoe had an idea that there definitely was some kind of policy or procedure to follow that, would ensure hopefully the safety of cordite and everything involved in it in his ships. And he believed that this was being followed in his ships, and by extension, he presumed that it was also being followed in Beatty's ships. And it's interesting that actually in even one of the letters, it specifically mentions a gradual relaxation of safety protocols that had occurred until the Battle of the Falkland Islands with Sturdy, and then memoranda had apparently been issued shortly thereafter telling everyone to shape up and get back into line. So the way I read it is that I think Beatty kind of knows that if not completely disabling flash protection systems, he at least has been very lax in the way his fleet has handled ammunition. And he's desperately trying to avoid that and put the blame on absolutely anything else. And pretty much everybody else who's a third party to the Battle of Jutland, but obviously has naval experience, is all going, yeah, the ammo handling thing, I think that could be a problem. And Beatty's going, no, absolutely cannot possibly be that. Because, of course, if the ship has been badly designed, if the propellant is unstable, or any of the other factors that Beatty has raised are true, that's not his fault. Whereas if it's been a case of poor ammunition handling, that is his fault. And he doesn't want it to be his fault. Angelico's kind of caught a little bit in the middle of all of it. And finally, for this half of the video, Daniel Silverthorne asks, after looking over the 1919 plans for the US South Dakota class, the BB-49-54, and seeing the extensive use of rivets and bolts, as would likely have been typical of the time, how much of these rivets and bolts could have been replaced by welding had the technology been more advanced when these ships were to have been built? Let's say using the level of welding capability from the newer 1930 South Dakota class on the older South Dakota class. How much weight might have been saved by these new construction methods? And how revolutionary was welding in actual weight savings practice? Well, it's quite interesting because if you look at US fast battleships, the use of welding is quite extensive up top in the superstructure, but once you get down low into the hull and right down at the bottom, apart from some segments of the bow, it's pretty much all still riveting, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Again, something I picked up looking through looking at USS New Jersey while she was in Drydock, and so we'll cover that in a bit more detail later on. However, it is rather interesting when you look at ships of the same class that were built with relatively little and a fair amount of welding. We do actually have some comparisons. The Leander and Arethusa classes in the Royal Navy, the first few ships were built almost entirely using riveting, with a little bit of welding, and by the end they were being built with quite extensive welding, and they both actually show a similar weight saving of about 4.5 to 5% of standard displacement. Now, of course, by the time the South Dakotas in the US are being built, US welding is ahead even more so because, well, it's a few years down the line and the US was ahead in welding technology anyway. So we'll be both slightly generous and slightly conservative and say it'll save you about 5% of your displacement. So we look at the South Dakota 1920 designs, 43,200 tons normal displacement. And that suggests that you would get it down to about 41,000 tons. So you'd be saving just over 2,000 tons of weight by applying extensive welding to the ship, which is a fair old amount. I mean, compared to the full load at 47,000 tons, you're talking about half the difference between normal and full loads. That might make a difference in speed, or if you are still happy with the ship weighing just over 43,000 tons normal, well, that's 2,000 tons of extra armor or additional weaponry that you can put on it. So that would make quite the difference. And that's it for part 1 of the Patreon Drydock. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you're still listening. See you again in part 2.